Hello, everyone. I'm Kathy Barnard, founder of the Save Your Skin Foundation and CONECTed. I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the traditional and unceded territory of the Sayelks Okanagan Nation. Welcome to the second and final day of CONECTed's webinar series. Yesterday, we had a fantastic day with 4 incredible presenters. Today, we look forward to the same. I'd like to quickly remind everyone of the Zoom housekeeping rules. Please keep yourself muted and hold your questions until the allotted Q&A portion. This webinar will also be live translated into French for those of you who prefer to listen that way. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our facilitator of the day and my colleague, Louise Binder. Louise is a lawyer and health policy advocate. She is presently a health policy consultant for Save Your Skin Foundation and one of the co-chairs of CONECTed, alongside Martine Elias from Myeloma Canada. Over to you, Louise.
Sorry, that just took a minute for my video to decide it wanted to come on. Thank you, Kathy, for those kind remarks. And I'd like to start by welcoming all of you, as well as Kath has, to the second day of our 2-day presentations on precision medicine. I'm the co-chair of the Collective Oncology Network for Exchange, Cancer Care Innovation, Treatment Access, and Education. And I share that honor with Martine Elias, who unfortunately could not join us today. So I will have the pleasure of facilitating today's webinar. Before we begin our webinars today, I'd like to start also with a land acknowledgement from my geographic location. So I respectfully acknowledge that in Aurora, we are on the traditional and treaty territories of the Chippewas of Georgina Island, who are Anishinaabe, and one of the first nations in Ontario. And we thank them very much for sharing this land with us. So yesterday, we had, yesterday we had a very, so again, I'm welcoming you for joining us for day 2 of our webinar series based on a business case that we created titled Getting Better Faster, the case for optimizing access to precision medicine in the wake of the revolution in cancer care. So CONECTed, which I've mentioned, the organization that developed this report, is a network of oncology groups that is centered on the fight for timely access to badly needed, safe and effective treatments, free of barriers across Canada for all who need them. Just as a quick recap from yesterday, the comprehensive paper follows the history of cancer from the early days of treatments to the amazing innovations in precision medicine in the wake of the cancer care revolution. Yesterday was a day describing the medical landscape in Canada in cancer, starting with a historical perspective, describing what we've learned about factors that optimizing success through treatments, and explain the profound value and future of precision medicine in cancer. We heard about the cost saving for the system, not to mention countless lives, by providing access to these treatments and the accompanying diagnostic tests. We heard from our patient representative about his harrowing experience to be tested and treated with a precision medicine that saved his life and decried that we live in a country like Canada that leaves people to do their own cancer care. Today, we take a different perspective, including the impact of government policies on access to treatment by the amazing Bill Dempster of 360 Public Affairs. I refer to him as a consultant's consultant. I mean that in the most respectful way, on top of being always in the know about trends in health policy now and with an eye to the future. So I turn it over to Bill to describe the Byzantine health policy landscape we have in Canada and implications as a result of navigating that landscape to get safe, effective treatments, including precision medicines and companion diagnostics into Canada and into the hands of patients who need them in a timely manner. So it's over to you, Bill.
Thank you. Let me just unmute myself, make sure that's working. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Kathy and Louise and everyone who has worked so hard to pull this business case together. I like how it's been coming out over the past 6 months, actually, and every time well, most recently when it was published, it's really well done. It's cogent, it's extensive, and what I've been asked to do today is set up the panel for the business case in a way that talks about public policy and the government policy perspectives on this. Let me just pull up my slides here. Okay, thank you for your patience. Share. Here we go. Okay. All right, getting better faster. Public policy and access to to precision cancer medicines. So I thought I'd start with a bit of a high-level background on where we are in Canada with respect to access to healthcare in general, and then we'll drill down to access to precision medicines and how precision medicines are actually dealt with at each level of the review process, and looking for opportunities to improve those systems so that patients can actually access precision cancer care and medicines more effectively. So starting with this poll was taken last year around this time, actually, towards the end of the year when there was a lot of issues with the health system, and a lot of them continue. Unfortunately, the US patients have more confidence in their health system in terms of getting access to emergency care than Canadians do. Only about a third of Canadians were very confident or confident that they would get access to emergency care in a timely fashion if they needed it. Well over 2/3 of US patients were confident, and this kind of puts a big question mark around Canada's belief in its healthcare system as almost a defining feature of who we are and what we are, and how we actually treat each other. In terms of healthcare over the past 10 or 15 years, this question was actually asked by Angus Reid as well around the CMA conference this past summer, and Canadians believe that the healthcare system, overall quality of the healthcare system has deteriorated, and that perspective has increased significantly than the last time Angus Reid did this poll in September of 2015. Over 2/3 of Canadians believe that the healthcare system has deteriorated in the last 10 or 15 years versus less than half when that poll was taken in 2015. Now, granted, we know the world changed in 2020 with COVID, but a lot of the cracks in those systems were already there and COVID exposed them. And I think that the report that we're talking to today makes that point very clearly as well. Trust in the ability to secure the best treatments in Canada. This is an Ipsos poll. It's been declining, and I'm looking forward to seeing an update to this. It looks like they're doing it every 2 years, but in 2020, there was a lot more confidence that the healthcare system would provide them with the best treatments, versus in 2022, that confidence dropped by about 10 points overall. But if you look, especially in parts of the country where the inequity and inequality and the challenges are more significant, Atlantic Canada in particular, that dropped by about half in terms of their trust in the healthcare system, provide them with the best treatments. And at the same time, there are more and more treatments coming available for cancer. And with nearly 40% of all therapies in the global pipeline are for cancers. So every year, there are more and more medicines that are going to be coming onto the market, at least the global market. And I think the real question for Canadians is what's happening here in Canada in terms of access to all of these medicines, many of which are precision therapeutics that have a companion diagnostics or rely on those biomarkers for their use. Now, Canada has established pathways for patient access, and I'm sure many of you on the line have seen this infographic before. We've actually, at 360, we put this together back in 2018, and I guess the sad part about it is it hasn't fundamentally changed since then. But this is a way to depict the two major paths to patient access for medicines. The escalator on the right, about 2/3 of Canadians rely on that faster access to their private health insurance programs, and that includes all civil servants across the country, and the majority of working Canadians have much faster access and a broader formulary in terms of funded therapeutics, generally in the range of 11,000 to 13,000 drugs are available through those private plans. Not to say that they're all doing fine, as many people on the line, especially in cancer, probably have experienced. I was talking to a really good friend who's got multiple myeloma. He just had a stem cell transplant. His fight with the private insurance program last year was horrendous, because they really were taking their time. And as you know, cancer cannot wait for that time to be taken. So that escalator, I think, has a few more hitches, given the different reviews that they are starting to put in place for certain cancer therapies. But that is almost nothing compared to the challenges on the public side, where a lot of cancer patients rely on access to medicines, some of them because they simply can't work or don't have a plan. Others, the total cost of these drugs are such that they are termed catastrophic. They would take up a large part of their income, and so they actually you need to get access to them through the public health program. So a certain percentage of your income is tested, and everything above that would be paid by the public plans. You would have to pay a deductible. The best ones in the country are Lake Ontario, around 3% of your income, which is still a very significant amount. But in terms of the steps and who does what and how long it takes, that's the focus of the report, how to make things faster. Well, Health Canada is generally fast and on target. It takes about 1 year for a regular review. On 6 months, they're looking at 3 things. A drug is of high quality. It is effective for what it says it's going to do. And I forget what the third one is. It's effective and it's safe. And that's just they don't necessarily compare that to everything else in the therapeutic class. Those are the three things. They leave the comparative clinical effectiveness to the next step. So 1 year for regular, 6 months for expedited review, and that's where a lot of cancer medicines get much faster access. And in fact, Health Canada is speeding that up even more with some global collaborations, and we'll talk about that in a second, the Project Orbis. They pass that over to CADTH. Sometimes CADTH can do that in parallel with Health Canada to look at comparative clinical and economic effectiveness. That generally takes between 6 and 8 months for their formulary recommendation. They decide reimburse, do not reimburse, or reimburse with conditions. It's almost always reimbursed with conditions. They are looking in comparison to other therapeutic options for that specific treatment. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the specific issues there. CADTH is also pretty good at meeting its targets in terms of reviews, and they're doing some interesting things to try to speed those up, and we'll get to that in a second. After you end up with that recommendation from CADTH, it's passed over to the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, and that's all of the public drug programs in the country, including several of the federal drug programs and all of the provinces. They jointly negotiate the terms of public funding, generally based on the CADTH recommendation, and sometimes the Quebec ENES recommendation. That of course has an impact on that Quebec flag that you can see in the PCPA deck. That can take around 8 months. It can often be more than a year, and on average, some of the data that we're seeing is it's around 300 days for those negotiations to happen. But you first have to get into those negotiations, and the PCPA has been slipping in terms of taking how much time between the CADTH recommendation and the PCPA picks that file up, and then they have to actually negotiate. Generally, one province will lead a negotiation, and all of the other provinces will check in to validate how that negotiation is going with the manufacturer. However, it sounds like the negotiations are all moving into the office of the PCPA, and we'll talk about that in a second, because I think there are some opportunities there for faster access as well. That letter of intent in terms of the listing terms will then be passed on to all of the public payers across the country. And Canada has, especially in cancer, different systems for who actually pays for what. In Western Canada, you've got the cancer agencies. It's soup to nuts. It's antiemetics, as well as IV cancer drugs administered in hospitals, and community pharmacies. They are, that's how it works in Western Canada. But as soon as you hit Manitoba and head east, it's much more of a mix between cancer agencies, hospitals, and the public drug programs. And it's quite a mixed bag about who pays for what. Now, they each have representatives at the PCPA. They will all be signing on, hopefully, to the letters of intent. But there is an open question about how quickly each one of those jurisdictions actually signs on or finalizes an individual product listing agreement with the manufacturer. And some simply don't. They've actually stepped out of those negotiations. But the timelines vary between Quebec is generally the fastest, and other provinces are much slower. Atlantic Canadian provinces are often tied to when new budget is available. So they're actually holding aside some certain indications for cancer drugs, or the first cancer drug, to decide whether and when they're going to be actually listing those drugs. Really important for patient access, and that goes down to the bottom, are the exceptional access programs. Those are critical pathways for precision cancer therapies, especially because in some cases, your clinician or your clinical team will know, or they're going to hear about an opportunity to use certain drugs in combination, or at certain lines of therapy that might actually benefit an individual patient. Talking about a business case, it's sometimes really challenging for the drug developer to have the business case to actually go back to the public health technology assessment, CADTH, and say, you know what, there are 20 more patients that could potentially benefit from this. That's another $100,000 application fee there, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of dollars to back that up and get it through the whole system. Even Health Canada has to approve of that indication sometimes to be able to use it. So it can be very challenging, and in precision medicine, sometimes we need even faster access to that. And other jurisdictions around the world have systems to be able to get those online faster in a funded way. Canada doesn't for the public system, and I think that's a really important issue to flag. The Ontario Evidence Building Program for cancer drugs is one example of trying to do that at the provincial level. The Passion d'Exception program in Quebec, which has got a big question mark around it right now, is another one that has been the gold standard across the country. But those are all under some pressure. I think that reports like the one that we're talking about today are a real call to get those individual provinces and these other systems up the line to figure it out with the idea of actually getting access to precision cancer medicines. And what that stepwise approach has led to is a sequential process generally that has led to long reimbursement timelines, upwards of 2 years between the time Health Canada gets an application and a provincial listing, and sometimes much longer than that. There is a possibility of parallel reviews. So Health Canada, the CADTH review can start before Health Canada has issued its notice of compliance or its approval for a drug. And the CADTH review as well can be, it's generally not faster than 6 or 7 months. But the PCPA negotiation process, while they say they can't start before the final CADTH recommendation, there are examples of very fast PCPA negotiations that have happened that are obviously almost pre-negotiated while CADTH has been reviewing the product. And so you can, although they won't say that, pre-negotiate in very select circumstances so that patients can get access very soon after the CADTH review. And then, of course, provincial listing, and that's when the final funded access happens on regular formularies. That's variable, but that's a provincial jurisdiction question. And we'll talk about that in a second because Louise asked me to address that. We're looking for a couple of almost what I'd like to call, what are the end points or the examples of success? And one of the big questions I think that the report calls out is, what is the availability and public reimbursement of new cancer medicines? And if we don't improve those versus our other developed countries, then we haven't been successful. And this is a couple of these charts from a report that came out earlier this year are talking about the availability of new cancer medicines in terms of funded access and formulary listings. Even on one formulary listing, we're way behind the EU and the US. If they took a snapshot of 83, Canada had very low availability of new cancer medicines, and the time it takes for those medicines to be reviewed, it's not all on the governments in terms of those delays. There is a significant delay in Canada for access because companies are deciding to launch them later here than they're launched in the European Union and in the United States. But overall, that leads to basically more than double the time it takes to get access for new cancer medicines compared to the EU, and almost triple what it takes to get to our neighbors in the United States. The PCPA timelines are not meeting their targets either, and this is another example of what we'd like to see in terms of the litmus test of success in terms of access to medicines. Now remember, this is all medicines, but the total days from the CADTH recommendation to a letter of intent is 300, and that's well over their target timeline of 180 days, and that's not even that also counts the time it takes for that product to be picked up and then negotiated. But the point is they're not meeting their own timelines. In fact, a very low percentage are. Other issues related to the HTA processes in the PCPA, and these are ones that we won't go into, although the panel later is going to talk about them. And Louise actually has done a lot of work on this and bringing it forward. The $50,000 ICER or incremental cost effectiveness ratio that is reported in the CADTH reports and recommendations very often leads to a 90+% price decrease that is required for that to be cost effective. Sometimes 97%, and sometimes it will not be cost effective at any price decrease. But we know a lot of these products actually do get negotiated. So it's an open question why we still have the 50,000 cost per quality ICER at all in those recommendations. And the only response we ever get out of CADTH is that the provinces and territories want it there, and they have not asked for that to be removed. And for me, I don't know if anyone remembers the Aerosmith. They had a requirement in all of their contracts that all of the brown M&Ms would be removed from the bowl of M&Ms that are expected in their trailer before they go into any concert. If they found any brown M&Ms in there, they would be worried about the quality of everything that was going on in what they would be experiencing at that concert venue. And it was a question of quality and why. For me personally, and I don't know, Louise, you can talk about it a little bit later, but having that 50K ICER in there with the price requirement that's so questionable in terms of its why it's there and what it's actually doing in terms of potentially dragging out negotiations is a flag, and it's a brown M&M, and I'm worried about the quality of some of the work that's more broadly. So I would flag that, because I know you flag it both in the report and in generally. Now, it's not, there are some really good things happening at CADTH, and we have to definitely tip our hat to them. They are looking carefully at how data is collected and used, including real-world evidence, non-traditional endpoints in cancer, and there's some interesting projects going on there that I think have huge relevance to precision cancer therapeutics, because they won't often have traditional endpoints being overall survival, because they're going to have phase 2 data. And they may have surrogate endpoints like progression-free survival or tumor size reduction, et cetera. And CADTH is looking at that and other aspects of real-world evidence to be able to support some innovative product listing agreements, et cetera. So keep an eye on those projects. I think that they are a real opportunity in this area. They have a new expert review committee that is test driving new processes and piloting things that will take up submissions from clinician groups and maybe from others, but they're not expecting all of the submissions to always come from the drug developers. This new expert committee is a really interesting opportunity for them to try new ways to look at these products differently, and there may be opportunities through those submissions and those reviews to test drive enhancements for precision medicines. Funding algorithms, diagnostics, those funding algorithms is an issue at CADTH, because that determines where in the line of therapy they recommend it for use. It doesn't generally increase the times of those reviews, but it could actually bump down the access to other products in the same therapeutic area for that specific line of therapy. So it is something that is important for patient organizations to keep an eye on. And I know a lot of people on the call have been engaged on that. PCPA and CADTH and others have been, and including PMPRB, have been active in global tables on price regulations, HTA negotiations, and I would say on broader health policy too. So that's something that we're certainly watching. And of course, very recently, PCPA has taken on its own being as a standalone corporation, and it plans to take on the lead of all negotiations going forward. It will no longer be each individual province is signing on to a letter of intent. It will be the new CEO of PCPA, among other things. And PCPA, CADTH, and Health Canada are looking for ways to speed access. And in this case, it is primarily being used and taken up by cancer medicines. So Project Orbis is led by the US FDA. There have been over 70 drugs that have gone through that. Basically, several health regulators around the world, they share the load of those reviews. And you can see really important products go from 6 months at Health Canada review to 3 months, or even faster than that. So that's a great innovation. One of the challenges is they come out with Health Canada approval. CADTH is dealing with a different level of evidence of those Project Orbis products. They're looking for ways to come up with time-limited reimbursement recommendations that will be limited to notice of compliance with condition drugs. So the condition is more evidence is required. Those will mainly be in cancer, but they are hoping that a recommendation can come out much faster through these time-limited reimbursement recommendations, as opposed to waiting for more data. They think that they will be able to provide positive recommendations to drugs with earlier data than would normally be the case, with the expectation that the developer would come back and have a reassessment of that afterwards. That's tied into the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance's temporary access process. And again, PCPA is trying to come up with a system that would provide temporary access while that data is being developed and then resubmitted, and then that would come into regular review. So keep an eye. I know that there's a big CADTH information session coming up in a few weeks. I think that's where we're going to hear and learn a lot more about how this will work. There are some concerns in terms of how this will work in practice. I'd like to see some actual case studies demonstrate, frankly, the business case for how it would work and how that would actually lead to faster access. But in general, I think this is a positive step in the right direction for faster access to precision medicines. Louise asked me to talk a bit about who does what across the country, and I don't want to take too much time here, but this is the context that all of the drug programs and hospitals and everyone are working under. The federal health transfers are a huge part of the health budgets across the country, generally around 20 to 22%. But there's more than just the Canada Health Transfer. They also are the primary public funder of CADTH. They promised a very significant funding for rare disease drug strategy, and in cancer, rare cancers may be a part of that, to the tune of $1.4 billion over 3 years. And they're also investing in and supporting Pan-Canadian health data strategy. Those are just 4 examples, but there are many more examples of where and how not Health Canada, the government of Canada is playing a role. Of course, the discussions around national pharmacare are one as well. They have their own jurisdiction, however. The Canada Health Act set out national criteria for the delivery of healthcare for hospitals and physicians for medically necessary care. Drugs are not part of that at the moment, and that's of course subject to a lot of debate. But in general, that's hospitals and physicians. That is also only the only thing that the federal government can do is claw back money in terms of transfers. They don't actually set out more criteria than that in terms of the requirements. They don't have any more teeth in that. Health Canada, of course, does its reviews for new drugs. They're responsible for patented medicines and intellectual property, which actually gives them the power of the PMPRB in terms of setting ceiling prices when there's an abuse of patent. And they also, have jurisdiction over advertising and marketing. They are a huge payer. They're the fourth biggest public drug plan in terms of overall size, in terms of who they support for access to publicly funded medicines. And then there's, of course, the public health role that FAC, or the Public Health Agency of Canada, played in the COVID response and in general across the country. And then they fund a huge amount of health research, over $1 billion a year. But it's in terms of access to precision medicines, it's the provincial and territorial governments that have the ultimate responsibility for health delivery and drug budgets. And that's where we spend a lot of our time in terms of access to precision medicines. A lot of people think, why doesn't the government of Canada or the Health Canada do a lot of this? Well, in fact, it's the constitutional jurisdiction of the provincial and territorial governments to do that. And as these national and pan-Canadian processes get set up, and I'm highlighting health technology assessments at CADF and the PCPA, there's an open question about this almost third layer of government. They are responsible to boards of directors, which are often the drug plan managers across the country, that are all eventually responsible to parliaments. But there is a question about how those organizations are accountable to stakeholders, like many of the people on the line, that I think is worth keeping an eye on. And they don't operate in a silo. All of these government agencies are operating in a cascade of not just public policy, but also fiscal policy. So affordability, deficits, and debt. The federal government's running $40 billion plus in deficit this year. All public governments we're over $2 trillion in terms of our public debt. And interest rates are not just affecting everyone on the line, they're affecting governments too. That's making it more challenging and crowding out other spending priorities. And the post-COVID focus on rebuilding the health and life sciences sectors. There's the evolution of the PMPRB and ceiling prices that they're trying to set that we talked about, and the report talks about a bit. Rare disease drug strategy I touched on. National pharmacare as a more umbrella question and strategy. What is going to happen in terms of the Liberal commitment to have legislation in the coming months? We can talk about that later, perhaps. Health technology assessment, we've spent a bit of time on already. Public drug programs, private drug programs. It's a cascade, and they all actually do affect each other and really impact when Canadians can get access to precision cancer medicines. I guess the question for the folks in the panel later is, how can we make sure that there is a flow and an opportunity for those medicines that are coming down the pipeline? And the good news is cancer is a very high priority for Canadians, and that's driven in part by events like today, but healthcare systems are listening. And we've got a multi-decade Canadian strategy for cancer control at the national level. You've got individual provincial cancer strategies, including one that came out earlier this year from British Columbia. PEI is highlighted, and of course, the Ontario Cancer Plan 6 is being reviewed and discussed today. So these are the opportunities for groups like this to really have an impact and say, hey, here's our report, take it to heart, implement it. And one of the best things I love about the report is for the call for metrics for success. So I'm hoping that the panel is going to get to talk to that. So I'll stop there and turn it back to Louise, and look forward to taking any questions that you might have and bring it on. And Kathy, I see you've got something on Project Orbis. I don't know if Louise, you want to interpret Kathy, or if Kathy wants to jump on herself. How do you want to do this?
Yes, I'll try to stick handle the questions. Kathy, Kathy's question is that in theory, but Project Orbis sounds good, but I'd like to know the definition of fast track. KIMTRAC, the first treatment for metastatic ocular melanoma was one of the first to be part of Project Orbis, and we're still waiting. Bill, as a start, maybe you could give us a little description about what Project Orbis is for those who might not know who are on the call, and then move along to Kathy's specific question about that project. Is that okay?
Yeah, 100%. Project Orbis was the brainchild of the US FDA. And the idea was, how can we get access to life-saving therapies? And it's not just cancer drugs, in a much faster way by harmonizing and cooperating with global counterparts in terms of the regulatory agencies across different jurisdictions. And so I believe there were 7 at the beginning. So there's Switzerland, the UK, the EMA out of the EU, Australia, Canada, and the US FDA. Japan, I believe, may be in there as well. And if it wasn't at the beginning, it is, I believe they are now. And over 70 drugs have actually gone through the system since it was started just a few years, around 5 years ago now. And I believe Health Canada has participated in over 50 of those reviews. And what that's led to, when Kathy, we say, have they fast-tracked? Well, they fast-tracked at the regulatory level. And so we're seeing products come through the system, and you end up with a Health Canada authorization much, much faster than even the expedited reviews that we would have received for something like metastatic ocular melanoma at 6 months. But your question is, where's the fast track for the rest of the system? We're still waiting for access to that specific product, even if it gets fast tracked at the regulatory level. And that's because the CADIT review may have said, and I'm not sure in the specific case, may have recommended against reimbursement for that specific indication. Even if it did review and give it a positive recommendation, that still would have taken 6 to 7 months. And then that would have been handed over to the PCPA, which probably would have taken some time to pick that up in terms of like, we're going to negotiate it. Here's the, who's the lead is going to be across the provinces, and the general expectations for that negotiation. And then it goes into that. And that can be a year plus too. So the problem is not Health Canada. And Project Orbis is an amazing thing in terms of getting access to life-saving therapies around the world. We just don't have the system downstream to be able to speed that up. They're making some steps in that direction. It will be for a very small subset of drugs. So the other question I'd have for that specific indication, was that a notice of compliance with condition that was given by Health Canada? If it wasn't, it would not have access to that CADIT temporary access process or program, and then it wouldn't have access to that PCPA PTAP, the temporary access process there either. So yeah, that's what Project Orbis is. It's not just sounding great in theory, it works really well. But in practice, in Canada, we can wait much longer. In fact, I've heard CADIT complain about Project Orbis in that Health Canada is approving drugs with early data, and that might not be enough or what they're expecting to be able to provide a substantive review at CADIT. I hope that helps.
Thanks. Can I just, I have a question of my own that I'll put up in a second, but just to follow along with Kathy's question, would it not be, CADIT has said that it is very interested in looking at real world evidence as a way of following along a drug past its original approval for reimbursement. Surely Project Orbis could be dealt with in that way, that put it on and follow it with real world evidence. Is that not a reasonable solution to the problem that they're raising?
It really, it could be, Louise. I think it totally is context and drug dependent. I talked earlier about, some products for like super rare genotypes or opportunities to provide really early access to a combination of cancer medicines, that you get Health Canada approval for that specific indication. Sometimes it's multiple manufacturers that need to actually cooperate to get that indication through. Real world evidence is a potential opportunity to support that, but sometimes we're talking about just handfuls of patients that could potentially benefit. So I get a little bit worried that we're going to try to build complex follow every patient systems that will require significant investment on patient support programs and even the health charities that might be running these registries. So I think for the bigger indications where there's precision medicines tied to a biomarker, especially in melanoma or lung, sure, we should definitely look for that, and RWE would be great, and maybe we'll get there eventually where we're going to have good enough systems that will be able to track individual patients with certain genotypes of their cancer that will need access. But I don't think we can wait for that. We should support the development of all those data systems, but Europe is way ahead. Like they have very early access. In France, you can actually get funded access to medicines even before they get approval by the EMEA. We're not doing that, and there's no good reason why, besides perhaps the cost. Some of those cost questions could be potentially negotiated or dealt with a lot faster or more expeditiously, as opposed to setting up all of these complex systems and then expecting them to come along. I think we have to have some more upstream questions. Okay, how do we actually get to where France is, as opposed to how do we set up more systems, which I get a little bit worried about.
Understand that. Following that, we have a question asking if you see a time when Project Orbis products will be prioritized throughout the full reimbursement process, specifically at PCPA and at the provincial listing process.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, other jurisdictions, they also have orphan drug designations. And I'm sure, we could talk about this too, I know others have, where, all cancer patients, if you can, sequence their genome, and even looking at a specific tumor and analyzing that very carefully, that people would say that they're all orphan drugs, or they're all like rare cancers. I think there's something to that. In orphan drug legislation in other jurisdictions, you will get designation, and that would provide potentially faster access or more incentives to bring and launch those products in those jurisdictions. Project Orbis products they don't retain that sort of designation as orphan drugs do in the US and Europe and elsewhere. I would like to see that, and I do think that that's something that CADTH and PCPA are trying to do. They wouldn't call them Project Orbis products. I think they might call them something else. And it's we'll see. I would like to see that happen. I think it goes back to the litmus test for success in all of this. Are more products being launched and made commercially available in Canada that are precision cancer medicines? That's litmus test number one. Litmus test number two, is patient access being provided in a timely way that is in line with our global competitors around the world? And build back from there. Don't necessarily, Canada is going to do it in a very Canadian way. for better or for worse. I'd like to see that, you know, more accountability to those metrics ASAP, and at the provincial level, at the national level, and at the federal level. Let's get at it. I know, Louise, you spent a lot of time on that.
I do. And I have a question that follows along from that. My understanding, and I'm sure it's yours, is that the provinces have the final decision about what to put on public reimbursement plans. And in fact, there's legislation in many provinces, if not all, that says exactly that. So if that's the case, are they basically just accepting CADTH recommendations to do this job that they've been given by starting pricing negotiations for the provinces at PCPA at CADTH's recommendations?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, that's of course, you know, a leading question, as we would say if we were wearing robes today, but we're not. It's the answer is in part, for sure. Like, they expect CADTH to work share to give them the information that they request to be able to make the decisions on listing a product or funding a product. And that's where, you know, the exceptional access programs that I mentioned are very relevant and important. And but I do get worried when a province will almost automatically turn around and say, either we're waiting for the CADTH recommendation or we're waiting for PCPA to finish before we can make any decision, including for exceptional access programs. Because we know that takes too long, and it's actually an abdication of their own responsibility for their citizens to provide access, often to life-saving medicines. And I think that that's really important in the cancer world. It's different from other therapeutic areas for that specific reason. And so, you know, that's why I'm especially worried about Quebec and some of the changes that I'm seeing there for their exceptional access program through Passion d'Exception. I'd like to see Ontario and other provinces be more open to providing earlier access and not just knee-jerk waiting for CADTH, waiting for PCPA, because that's what the process requires us to do. I think we have to start asking, what should we do as a jurisdiction based on our responsibility under the Constitution and for our citizens?
Thank you. So I don't see any other questions, and we're really at time for your presentation in any case, but I really want to thank you so much for trying to help us understand as best we can what I call the Byzantine sort of processes that we have in this country. God bless the Canada Health Act and all that, but it certainly is an interesting problem to have drugs really under the umbrella of the provinces, but the access to doctors and hospitals under the umbrella of the federal government. It definitely leads to some interesting opportunities for all of us. I'm sure you'd agree.
Yeah, I do 100%. And Louise, I know you've got more sessions between now and 2 p.m. Eastern, but I'll turn my camera off, pass it back to you, but I'll still be participating in the chat to do my best to respond to some of the questions that came in a little bit late. Would you like me to do that? Or
that would be wonderful if you could do that. Thank you so much for that. Yes, we would very much appreciate it.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Louise. Take care.
Take care. Thank you. Okay.
Bye-bye.
And now I have the great pleasure to introduce Dr. Rebecca Auer. She's the director of the Cancer Research Program at the Ottawa Hospital, and she's going to be discussing the challenges and opportunities we have to bring these treatments to the clinic. So over to you, Dr. Auer.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just gonna share my screen here. So thank you so much, Louise, for the opportunity to participate. And I'm on call all week, so I've missed the talks this morning. I just caught the tail end of Bill Dempster's talk, and so I'll say right at the outset that I apologize if my talk is at a lower level than the kinds of discussions you're already having. I think this having an opportunity to listen into these talks, hopefully I'll be able to at a later date listen to the audio. I think would be a huge learning experience for me. So I'm pretty new to this space of advocacy, but not new to this space of cancer research. And so I'll just give you my take on cancer research, but it might not be at the level of inquiry and conversation that perhaps you've been used to. So I'm a cancer surgeon and director of cancer research at the Ottawa Hospital. And what I know for sure in my 15 years of looking after cancer patients is that cancer patients really want hope. And I love this quote from Christopher Reeve. He said, "Once you choose hope, anything is possible." And I think for cancer patients, at least from my perspective, hope is not even so much the outcome, but having it there every day to live your life. And it's amazing, if you start studying hope in cancer patients, you can see that it's actually important even in the very last parts of life. And people hope for different things, but surprisingly, even people with a terminal diagnosis continue to hope for a therapy that may extend their life or even eradicate the cancer. And that hope really allows you to move forward with your day and have the joy and gratitude and courage to face the diagnosis. I personally believe that research is a place that can fuel hope. And I think in the last couple of decades, we've seen some pretty transformational changes in cancer treatments that really underscore that hope does exist in that cutting edge research space. I had dinner with my kids some years ago now. My middle son was 7 at the time, and I guess he'd been talking at school about a growth mindset. But he said to us at dinner, what is the most powerful word in the English language? So I thought it was thanks. My elder son, who was 9 at the time, thought it was love. My younger son, who was 3 at the time, thought it was watermelon. But we didn't hold him to that. But my 7-year-old said it's yet. He said, yet changes every sentence into an impossibility to a possibility. And I truly believe in the power of yet and the power of research to bring us to yet. I think if we want to talk about where we're going with cancer research, we have to remember what our roots are and where we've been. So I know that probably everyone on this call or listening to this will be very familiar with the backbone treatments for cancer that are still the backbone treatments today for most patients: surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy. And you have to remember that the infancy of chemotherapy came from war toxins. So in fact, what the father of chemotherapy, who's Dusty Rhodes, pictured here on Time magazine, he actually came from the head of the chemical weapons division of the US military in the war. So really the concept here in most cases was be as radical as you can be with either your surgical resection, your chemotherapy, essentially poison, or your targeted radiation, and try and kill the tumor without killing the patient. But this, and let's be honest, this has changed cancer treatments and outcomes, and that backbone has been very important in transforming some cancers for sure. They have been successful in prolonging life, and in some cases, in combination or alone, have been able to cure patients. But we know that they have a significant cost to the patient's quality of life and to what they have to endure, both during treatments and then in many cases permanently. Well, where are we now with cancer research? I would say in the last quarter century, there has been a very disruptive explosion of technologies that has really brought us to a place where we are accelerating almost faster than we have the imagination for. Think about the human genome, which was sequenced in 2001. It was less than a quarter of a century ago. It cost close to $1 billion and took about 13 years for one genome. Now we can sequence a genome in about 24 hours, and it can be as low a cost as $1,000 per genome, depending on the quality and depth. So this is a pretty incredible transformation. A picture of the DNA being cut out is supposed to represent CRISPR-Cas9 technology of gene editing, which has completely transformed cancer research and very likely will transform cancer care and other care in the future. And then this lab on chip is the concept of microfluidics. So things that we used to study in a petri dish with, tons of plastics and tens of thousands of wells and might take about 10 months can now be done on a single chip of this size with a fraction of the material, and actually could be done in less than a week. So these kinds of incredible disruptive innovations in cancer research are here today. And so what does that mean for cancer therapies? It means that we're looking at we've really looked under the hood of the cancer cell to really understand what are the molecular changes in cancer cells, what are the targets, how does our immune system interact with cancer cells, how does the host interact, and really becoming more precise in our oncologic treatment, meaning targeting the cancer cell without targeting the normal cell, and then personalized. So your cancer may look the same on the outside, but it's very different under the hood. And so each patient may have a personalized approach to that cancer, or we may use your own cells, particularly those of the immune system, to then target the cancer. So as we all know, cancers are caused by mutations, and usually mutation after mutation to add on till the cell is dysregulated and no longer responding in the way that normal cells respond. So those signals that are given to tell the cell to kill itself, to tell the cell to stop growing, they don't respond to those signals because of these mutations that give them the ability to grow without signals and to stay alive without the need for additional signals. Many years ago, Ehrlich, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in immunology, had sort of coined the term the silver bullet, which seemed to work pretty well when you tried to kill a pathogen like syphilis. But everyone at that time was looking for the silver bullet, the magical molecule that would kill the cancer cell and not the normal cell, and something common for all cancers. And I think that concept of a silver bullet doesn't exist, but the concept of maybe a million silver bullets or a combination of silver bullets maybe actually does exist when we look at very specific molecular mutations that cause very different behaviors in cells. So, and again, I suspect this audience is very familiar with this, but if we have a cohort of cancer patients in the gray here, and then we do molecular profiling, so otherwise called biomarker testing, molecular oncology, genomics. We can separate these people based on their molecular mutations, and today we kind of do it based on one mutation. So this is a BRCA mutated, this is an MSI high, although in reality many mutations exist in many patients at one time. And then in theory, the way it's supposed to work is that then if you have this mutation, then you would get this targeted drug, and these people with this mutation would get this targeted drug, etc. And again, our understanding of cancer biology and our ability to then translate that into molecular therapies has really exploded. And you can see in this graph, over again the last quarter of century, the number of approvals for cancer drugs in the last 20 years has really skyrocketed. So for a long period of time, there wasn't a lot of new approvals, and now all of a sudden we have many new approvals. So it's definitely an exciting time. And then what about immunotherapy, also so transformational in the cancer space, and really built on an understanding that when trained appropriately, when activated appropriately, our immune system can probably recognize cancers as different from normal cells. So we have the power within our own bodies and our own immune system to tackle the cancer in much the same way that we tackle pathogens, viruses, bacteria. And so really, again, what most of us think of as immunotherapy is the checkpoint inhibitors, so anti-PD-L1, anti-CTLA-4, and they really take the brakes off our T cells, our immune cells. But there are others, including CAR T cell therapy, where we engineer patients' own immune cells to fight the cancer. There's vaccines, of course, which we're so familiar with in pathogens, but can also be used for cancer therapies, viruses, and cytokines, which are molecules that directly stimulate our immune cells. So this is another transformative area in the last two decades. This is just a nice video illustrating if it will work. Maybe it doesn't on the. Yeah, sorry. It was a video of a T cell killing a cancer cell. I don't think it will work in this format, unfortunately. And I'll just, in case anyone in the audience doesn't know what a CAR T cell therapy is, and this is just one of many personalized cell-based therapies that are now being explored in clinical trials, and many, many, many more in the preclinical and translational space. But essentially, in this case, you collect a patient's white blood cells, you isolate their T cells, which are cells that are directly responsible for killing, and they kill cells based on the surface expression of various molecules we call antigens. They engineer them with a virus usually so that they are specifically going to kill the cancer cell of interest. And currently the one that most people are familiar with is targeted against a CD19 molecule, which is present on B cells, but also present on a lot of leukemias and lymphomas. Although again, in the pipeline, there are so many more coming. These cells are expanded to the sort of billion level and then infused back into the patient that has had their immune system, their regular immune system, depleted to make room for these cells. And this again has transformed lymphoma and leukemia care over the world, and really has opened the door for us to see the potential of this type of personalized cell therapy. So I wanted to start with just 3 stories, patients that I know well, patients that I've been, interacted with either as a physician or on a personal level, that really show you how incredibly beneficial these treatments are when we can access them and give them to patients. So this young man is Hayden. And Hayden was 22 years old. He was a professional soccer player that during COVID had gone to Florida on a soccer scholarship to study, and was living there and couldn't come home because of COVID, but was having some rectal bleeding. 22, so of course his coach thought it's probably just hemorrhoids. But then when he finally did go home and told his mother said, no, we're going to the doctor. And unfortunately, he did have a locally advanced rectal cancer. So I'll tell you that the treatment currently for locally advanced rectal cancer is a combination of chemotherapy and radiation, followed by surgery, and often with a permanent or at least temporary colostomy, and in about 25 to 30% of cases in men, some impotence. So a pretty significant thing for a professional soccer player who's in his 20s to deal with. When I saw him, he didn't have any mutational testing. And at the time, it wasn't a standard of care to do so. But because of how young he was, despite the lack of family history, we decided to pause on the radiation and chemo, which was set to start the following week, and get molecular testing. And it turns out that he had an MSI high cancer, which means he had a very specific mutation in a protein that repairs DNA. And in clinical studies, this has been very responsive to the anti-PD-L1 checkpoint blockade immunotherapy. It was not approved for use, still not approved for use in this indication. We did not have a clinical trial, but we were able to use a research experimental pathway to get him this treatment. You can see he had immunotherapy for 4 months. This is a few weeks before his surgery. He is enjoying some swimming with his friends. This does not look like a kid who has locally advanced cancer and is undergoing cancer treatments. We did surgery on him, successfully removed the rectum, joined things back together. He did not have a permanent colostomy or any other significant side effects, and the tumor was completely gone in the specimen. There was no signs of tumor, and now he's enjoying his second year of law school in Toronto. Really a wonderful story in my mind to show how transformational this can be. This is Adam. Adam was a 49-year-old gentleman. He was diagnosed with a rare cancer called bile duct cancer. At the time he was started on standard of care chemotherapy. Immunotherapy had been approved by Health Canada at that time, but was not and is still not funded in any province that I know, certainly in Ontario. But he did receive immunotherapy through a compassionate access program, through private pay, because molecular testing is also not funded for this cancer. He received molecular testing and had a mutation in a gene called BRCA, which many of you are probably familiar with. BRCA mutations in common cancers, prostate, breast, ovary, where these mutations are more common. Prostate, a PARP inhibitor, which is a molecularly targeted drug, is approved. But of course, in a rare cancer like bile duct cancer, when we do the math, there's probably about 20 patients at best in Canada a year with this combination of mutation and cancer. So of course, no clinical trials have been done. But fortunately, through out-of-pocket costs, which are not insignificant, Adam has been able to be on a PARP inhibitor combined with the immunotherapy, ongoing with essentially what appears to be a complete response, back at work, enjoying life as a father and full-time professional. Lastly, this is Camille. Camille was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia in January 2020. She was 35. She was a single mom of a young daughter. She received a lot of different standard of care treatments, stem cell transplant, but unfortunately she recurred. She was not eligible for CAR T-cell therapy that's funded at least in Ontario, because she was too old by about 5 years, I think. But fortunately, because of a research protocol, she was able to receive CAR T-cell therapy through the CLICO-1 trial funded by BioCanRx with a made in Canada CAR T-cell, and has had a complete response, is now thought to be cured, and is back enjoying life and raising her teenage daughter. So this all sounds pretty good. We have amazing cancer research happening. That research is being implemented into care through clinical trials, and patients are doing well. But I think everyone here knows that's not exactly the reality. Although this in theory is how it should work, what really works, what really happens is, if molecular testing is funded at all provincially, it's funded for a couple of genes. And so you may find a few people, and then it may be available as a standard of care, and that's usually where the molecular testing is funded. If there is a drug that is made available and is paid for by the government, but by and large, for many people, like Adam with rare cancer and a BRCA mutation, there is no way to access that drug. You might be able to find a site-specific clinical trial, although, again, in Canada, it's much less likely. And again, it might only be one center, maybe in downtown Toronto, downtown Montreal. You might be able to find one of these basket trials or a site-agnostic clinical trial, but again, can be challenging to find. You might be able to get the drug on compassionate access, or even possibly through your insurance. Otherwise, you might be looking at an out-of-pocket expense. And the reality is, for most patients, there is no access. So the problem with this is the access is limited and often is isolated to those people who live in certain geographic areas or have enough money to be able to pay for these drugs out of pocket, which is not that many Canadians. And that's the problem that we have today. But tomorrow, we're not going to have 30 or 40 or 50 different genes. We're going to have thousands. And we're going to have many genes in one person. We're going to have many different targets. I think it's just a matter of time. And the truth is that when most labs do test for the 1 or 2 genes that are funded, they're actually testing for many, many more. They may not be doing something called whole genome sequencing. We're really looking at the entire spectrum, but they might in fact be doing a panel of 160, 170 genes. But the reality is, if only 2 of them are funded by the government, there's only really 2 that are going to be reported. And this is happening in labs all across, at least Ontario, and I think many other provinces, where the rest of the data is just sitting on the computer. It's not released, it's not used, it's not available. This group, Access to Genomic Testing, has recently released their report, and at least in Ontario, their readiness grade for implementing comprehensive molecular testing for cancer was pretty bad. It was a D. So I think we're not quite there in most provinces to be able to offer it, and I think we really need to get there, because we can't ask the questions if we about drugs if we don't know what the targets are. So again, I think major barriers access to molecular testing. Even if we do know the few, even if we do have a mutational profile and understand what mutations there are, we have not had the same kind of disruptive transformation in the clinical research space that we've had in the preclinical or translational research space. So when you think about how incredibly different the way we do research is over the last quarter of a century, how completely transformed our preclinical research space has been, there's been very little change to our clinical research space. We still look at drugs going from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. Phase 3 being, thousands of participants, they're all the gray people, and then seeing what works, and some work, some don't work. I think Dr. Dave Stewart, who's one of the oncologists here, often says it's like trying to figure out the ideal shoe size for everyone in Canada. You will come to an answer and it will fit, the majority of participants, but it's not really the question it's not a question that's relevant anymore. So I think we need to start thinking about different ways that we can ask these questions, because of course a phase 3 trial is not going to work when you have a unique molecular subtype of cancer, especially if your cancer is not a very common one to begin with. Then you take a rare cancer and make it an ultra rare cancer, and these questions will never be answered. So access to clinical trials I see as a second barrier. And then lastly, I think our ability to translate our Canadian innovations to Canadian therapies and for Canadian patients is also an area where there is a significant barrier. So prior to COVID-19, I think we all realized during COVID-19 and the lack of vaccine manufacturing that there really wasn't that much investment in Canadian biomanufacturing. We have some amazing biotherapy researchers in Canada, and including, for example, the researcher who designed the lipid nanoparticle for the mRNA COVID vaccine that I recently received the Nobel Prize. The lipid nanoparticle was originally designed in BC and was for a cancer vaccine. So these things are really actually quite related. And it's not just the lack of infrastructure, it's also the lack of people trained to do this type of work, so the highly qualified personnel. And as an example, CAR T-cell therapy was approved in Canada in September 2018, but at that time, Canada was really caught standing still. So first of all, the approval wasn't based on phase 3 data, it was based on a phase 2 single-arm study, but the results were so compelling that was what ultimately led to the approval. At the time when it was approved, there had only been 2 clinical trials in Canada, both at Princess Margaret, meaning that our doctors had no real experience with this therapy. There was only one Canadian center and a handful of clinicians and nurses that had any experience treating these patients. We had not manufactured a product in Canada ever. And there was all these high-performing research teams across Canada that had already, in the preclinical space, moved on to 2.0, 3.0. And how are we going to take advantage of this, or instead of having them simply be licensed to U.S. companies and manufactured there? So I think access to biotherapeutics is also a huge barrier. And I think the solution, at least in part, is to start to realize that care and research have to have a more seamless integration. So I think there's this concept called the common rule, which separates what is clinical care and what is research. And increasingly, I think we're spending a lot of time trying to figure out what is care and what is research. If I do a panel of 117 genes, and 2 of them have an approved molecular target and the other 115 don't, is reporting those genes research? Is acting on those results research, or is it still care? Where is that line drawn? And I would argue that as long as we have patients' best interest in mind, as long as we are absolutely cognizant about our value system around protecting patients and making sure they understand their rights, I think it's time to try and blur this line and to stop seeing each in their own box, both from a funding point of view, and even from a regulatory and translation point of view. If we can start to see that research is care, then research can hopefully provide hope to patients today, but we would need to be able to fully integrate it into care for all patients. I think all patients, as much as all patients deserve good cancer care, they also deserve an opportunity to participate in cancer research. So we need to have access to molecular testing. We should have an equitable and future-proof approach to molecular testing. And when I say future-proof, I mean we don't just test the mutations that we know have targets that are approved today, which is a bit reactionary and what frankly is happening in most places. But we should have a future-proof concept where we test for mutations that might be important tomorrow, that we know are coming down the pipeline. And actually, most labs are already doing this. They're just not reporting the results. We need to have better access to clinical trials, and we probably need a direct investment there as well as a concept of decentralization. So, for example, direct funding for clinical trial infrastructures at academic centers and community centers so that you can participate in a clinical trial, even if you're not at a large academic center or in a large urban cancer center. And this has been done in places like the UK. Having something like a single national REB and even contracts, pre-approved contracts between cancer centers would potentially help with the delivery of cancer clinical trials. And I know the CCTG, the Canadian Cancer Trials Group, it does an amazing job of trying to fill that role, but I think we could certainly do better, especially with governmental support. Maybe providing incentives for industry to come to Canada and undertake clinical trials, especially for novel agents in high fatality cancers. We need to reduce barriers for participation across provincial boundaries, and most importantly, decentralize trials so that it isn't as important that your geography and your socioeconomic class, you still have the opportunity to participate. And these types of things are being looked at in other places and were particularly useful during COVID, especially in the UK with the National Health Service, allowing them to really accelerate their COVID-19 therapeutic research. I'm certainly no expert in this. There are other groups have been working really hard, the Canadian Cancer Clinical Trials Network and Accelerating Clinical Trials Group. But I think this is what we need to see happen. We also, as Bill talked about real world data and Louise mentioned it too, but I think you can't have real world data if you don't do the testing and you don't provide the drugs. We'll never learn anything. So we need to figure out a way, maybe as part of Canada's rare disease strategy, to get targeted agents to cancer patients and measure the data for success. And I think that was just talked about in the last session, but I think this is really paramount. And this, I think, could be done through a clinical research protocol, but it has to be done in a different way than our current paradigm of Health Canada regulated clinical trials. And I hope that we need to reduce the disparities in access to testing and access to these agents. Otherwise, we're only going to learn, something about patients who are wealthy enough to afford the drugs, or who are in a particular geographic location where they can access them through other programs. And then we need to support translation of discovery research into biotherapy. So certainly Canada has a biomanufacturing and life sciences strategy, and there's been huge investments in that. But I think it can't just be for pandemic preparedness. We should have those strategies in place for cancer therapies today. We should have projects that focus on cancer therapies. If a pandemic, if we have another pandemic or a resurgence of COVID-19, we can turn and pivot quickly, but we would have the infrastructure and the highly qualified personnel who know how to do this. We should translate Canadian discoveries in Canada to benefit Canadian patients. And BioCanRx was particularly effective at doing this, funded by the federal government, of translating Canadian biotherapies into Canadian patients. And in fact, when we look at their success, there was 707 cancer immunotherapy clinical trials in Canada in the 2 decades between 2002 and 2022. Only 4% of those were based on Canadian inventions, but half of those trials were directly attributed to BioCanRx. So it's a start. We certainly need more. Unfortunately, BioCanRx funding is somewhat uncertain, and I think definitely need to see this program and other programs like it. They're also focused on generating point-of-care manufacturing networked facilities, and this has enabled the CLICA-1 clinical trial, the one that Camille was on, the one that saved her life, and many others in Canada who could not access CAR T-cell therapies through a standard way. So I think this is an example of these are research protocols, research endeavors, but very clearly supporting clinical care with clinical care results. And again, this is what I mentioned, that we have a biomanufacturing investment by ICID, but we need to move well beyond pandemic preparedness. For Hayden and families like that, for every Camille and her daughter, for every Adam and his family, there are so many other families who are not getting access to treatments that are available today. And I do think that if we could blur that line between cancer research and cancer care, we could really make meaningful impact in patients, and it wouldn't be the Wild West. We would actually learn something. We would learn something every time a patient got tested, every time a patient got treated, but we need to have the will to do it. I am a big fan of Terry Fox. It's an incredible young man who so many years ago had this vision to run across the country on one leg to raise money for cancer research. We have this legacy in Canada. We believe in this model, and I think we just need to re-inspire the country to make this happen. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I know that you started out by apologizing for thinking that your presentation didn't have profound health policy implications, but I assure you that that's absolutely not the case. You brought up so many important issues for us, and you started with hope, and that really is true. People need to have hope if they're going to have any opportunity to get access. But then, of course, you raise the issues of the barriers to access that we really need to try to overcome. If you have any questions for Rebecca, please put them in the chat. I'll ask a question or two, if I may, while we're waiting. what, you know, there seems to be this rather great chasm between the innovation and the pace of innovation in cancer and in other areas, and the way that we look at that research and those innovations in terms of approving them for sale in this country, but even more in reimbursement for these treatments. What would you say to policymakers to explain to them why this chasm has got to be breached, and why they need to understand that research is care and needs to get to people quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, there's this sort of thought that, you know, it's reasonable to wait 2 or 3 years from, you know, a phase 3 clinical trial when even we have one, or sort of a promising drug to then be funded. But, you know, cancer patients do not have that time. There's a sense of urgency that is, I think, being missed, and becomes really apparent when you or your family members is, you know, part of this, unfortunately develops a diagnosis like this. But I think, so I think we have to really completely reframe our ideas of what research is. I mean, there is a very good reason why strong ethical sort of framework around the conduct of research in human patients had to be implemented. I mean, there was some atrocities that happened, and I think most of us are aware of them, the Tuskegee study being one absolute tragedy, and there are other examples of that. And so I understand that, but I think in some places research is still a dirty word. And I think that's part of the problem, that we think of research as being an experiment on a human, maybe, you know, putting participants at undue risk to potentially answer a question for the good of science. But I think especially in the cancer space, that isn't true anymore. We have really compelling therapeutics. We do need to understand where they work, where they don't work, but we need to understand that in a very individual basis. And it might not be every single patient, but it might be this handful of patients, that handful of patients. We need to start to see that differently. The randomized control trial is not gone, but it had its day and it works very well when you don't completely understand the biology. But if you have a comprehensive understanding of the biology, then we can't expect 1,000 people to sign up. It's either going to work or it's not going to work. And we just need to have a different way of asking that question, and a different expectation of what leads to approval.
And so we have a question in the chat from Alan Chatkowski. He was one of our speakers yesterday and gave a compelling explanation of his harrowing journey to become properly tested and properly treated for his cancer. So he says, totally agree, research is care. Testing more genes than we have answers for is indeed research. Genomic aberrations of unknown significance today will be addressed over time. Given that some countries are providing access to patients faster than others, would you support a cooperative global shared research drug access program for patients and physicians where they could access drugs from any country?
That is an amazing thought. I've never even heard of that concept before, but what a cool idea. I don't know enough about how these things would work to ever imagine that happening, but yeah, I think again, like getting patients access to testing, even those genes that we don't know their significance, or we don't know their significance in that disease site perhaps, and then having access to therapies and monitoring the response, and getting that data. The problem is that now I think it's happening, especially in Canada. Wealthy people will get a drug. No one's collecting the data. No one's learning anything. There's this huge disparity. If we could fix that and actually learn something while we did that, and learning it on a global level, especially for rare cancers, like bile duct cancer is an example, and many other examples where there's just so few patients, even in our country, that that's, anyway, very cool idea. Wouldn't know enough about it, but love it.
Well, that's good to hear. You know, you spoke about disparities between people who have money and people who don't. And we say in this country that we believe in equitable access to treatments, and that everybody should be able to access treatments. And yet, really, the practical, in practice, that does not happen. Have you got any suggestions of how we can bridge that gap as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, if we could somehow create a partnership between where what governments pay for and what researchers pay for example. So, you know, I mean, a good example in Ontario is that OICR had this very useful program of molecular profiling called Octane, where solid tumors were profiled. They learned a lot. And really, like, I'll be honest, in Ottawa, where we didn't have our own molecular oncology lab in the research space, that was in some ways how we were providing molecular testing for patients. We were really using it as clinical care. And then the Ontario government moved forward with some approval of funding for certain molecular testing for certain disease sites. And then Octane just closed, and now every kind of lab can do molecular testing if they're signed up to do it. No centralization of data, no joint learning. So, you know, why would that be? Like, why wouldn't there be some kind of interaction between the Ontario Institute of Cancer Research, say, listen, we've got this great program. Why don't you give us some provincial money and we'll expand it? And then ultimately offer care, and then train labs to be able to do this in their own center. But data always has to go back. And I just, you know, again, I'm not a politician. I'm not an administrator in that space. So maybe I'm simplifying it, but it just seemed to me like a huge lost opportunity. Our lab has a massive Dell drive of data, unanalyzed, of molecular mutations of our patients. We only analyze the ones that the Ontario government funds. It seems like a very sad missed opportunity.
So we have another question from Deb Maskins. Excellent presentation. My question is, are you aware of any clinical trials in Canada similar to the NCI match study that matches I'm losing, I lost her. Yeah, can you read it? Yes,
yeah,
I'm sorry, I lost her.
Yeah, so there are some trials, like the CCTG, the Canadian Cancer Trials Group, has a trial called CAPTOR, similar to the one in the US called TAPER, where there's baskets. So there's kind of like a basket trial, they call them, where there's, you know, maybe 10 different baskets for different mutations, and each basket has a different therapeutic. And that does provide access, which is great. And because it's run by the CCTG, fortunately, it's open at many centers across Canada. I think those trials are good. It would be great to have potentially more trials like that. I think they don't tend to lead to an approval per se, because they're a bunch of different tumors with that mutation, but certainly can give signals of efficacy that would then hopefully be able to be disease site specific. So there are some. I think it would be great if there was more.
Just a couple more questions. from Meg Barker. I'm very appreciative of your well-developed presentation. The success of BioCanRx is particularly noted. Did the wrap down of the Networks of Centers of Excellence program have a negative impact? What type of messaging can we deliver to policymakers that will help them understand that the funding gaps need to be refilled?
Yeah, a huge negative impact for sure, because I think BioCanRx was one of the most successful NC programs that existed, and they had a very good chance of being refunded through that program. And so the closure of that program then left kind of a gap. And my understanding, it took a while to figure out what options there were. And then ultimately they have applied to the SSF, I think it's called, and are waiting to hear. We're supposed to hear actually in the spring and still have not heard. So again, I'm certainly not the expert on BioCanRx, but I do know it's had a hugely negative impact. They're waiting to find out if they have further funding. But I think, you know, it was very exciting to see the investment in biomanufacturing. What was a little bit disappointing is that they didn't see the value in investing in projects that would support cancer. Because again, as I said, like, you can do all the exact same GMP manufacturing, development, translation of innovation, validation, etc., for a cancer vaccine, for a cancer cell product, for all those things. And we could use those today. And then if we need to focus our energy on the next COVID or whatever it's called, then it's an easy pivot and you have all the people trained. It doesn't make sense to be doing projects, in my mind today, that are for a pandemic that we don't have now, or we have no idea what it's even going to look like. And we have an epidemic of cancer today.
I think the next comment really sums up how a lot of us feel. I would imagine that many people facing a terminal diagnosis would happily agree to participate in a trial if they were given a choice. And I have to say, I was in that situation myself many, many years ago, where I was given a very short time to live, and then suddenly there were trials, and I certainly raised my hand. And so I can't imagine that that's changed over the years. Would that be your sense of it as well?
Absolutely. And the other thing is around sharing of data. You know, my experience, we started the Canadian Cholangiocarcinoma Collaborative, and my experience with the bile duct cancer patients is anything that you need from my medical chart that might help others, that might help me. So I think we're very worried about this line in the sand. And I understand we need to protect patients' privacy, their autonomy, but I think we've gone way over to the other side, and we forget that patients, you know, not only want to, they deserve, they have a right to participate in research.
Thank you. Well, I think we're going to have to stop there, although I'm sure we'd love to go on much longer, and we appreciate you taking time. I know how busy you are, and we really, really appreciate the time that you've given us today. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation and your attention. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So now, for some, as they used to say, for now, something completely different, although I doubt it really will be, we have a wonderful patient group roundtable, and we have three amazing, fantastic oncology patient community leaders, if I may call them that, and they're working in the trenches every day with patients. So I'd like to introduce Kathy Barnard, President and CEO of the National Melanoma Group, Savior Skin Foundation, Filomena Servidio-Italiano, President and CEO of the Colorectal Cancer Research and Action Network, and Bob Bick, a health policy consultant specializing in patient access and reimbursement, and a lead member of the CanCertainty campaign. So if we can see our panelists. Welcome to the three of you. I'm going to start with Kathy. Kathy, I want to ask you that with your years of experience seeking access to cancer treatment for patients, and these days precision medicines, what can you tell us about the experiences of helping these patients day after day?
Well, firstly, to add on to Dr. Auer's presentation, my 3 words, I don't have just one word choice. I have 3, which would start with research, which gave me hope, which got me to survivorship. Because most of you know I would not even be presenting today if it wasn't for all 3 of those. You know, when we heard from Dr. Smiley yesterday in his presentation, he really outlined those early days of innovative medicines in the melanoma space. And it kind of, in the old days, well, not even in the old days, 20 years ago, there were no treatments for metastatic melanoma. And then all of a sudden in 2009, we had a rapid succession of innovative treatments. In 2009, again, we received, as Dr. Auer would say, a number of silver bullets. The first BRIM study for the BRAF mutation came in 2009. Then we got the single targeted treatment was approved for the BRAF mutation by Health Canada in 2011. Shortly after that, Health Canada approved the first combination of targeted treatment. And then in 2018, Health Canada approved combination targeted treatment in the adjuvant setting. And then just recently in 2021, Health Canada approved another combination of targeted treatment. So in 2010, when targeted treatments were being discussed in the medical community, BRAF testing, believe it or not, was only done in a lab in Calgary. So results were taking like 4 to 5 weeks in some instances because all physicians, treaters across Canada were sending those tumors to be tested in Calgary. When Dr. Smiley and I did an extensive education campaign, he still refers to it as the Mike and Kathy Dog and Pony Show. We traveled from province to province, cancer center to cancer center, doing physician education symposiums in the AM, and then patient education symposiums in the afternoon. From those multidisciplinary physician symposiums, we created a Canadian Melanoma Task Force of Physicians, which is still running today. When it started in 2010, it was 5 deep. Now it's probably 50 deep. We worked with our partners to raise awareness of BRAF testing with campaigns like the Melanoma Just Got Personal. And we started hosting a number of webinars for patients that were being done by surviving patients that had had the targeted treatment, really about the importance of the quick BRAF testing. By 2020, we had shortened that turnaround time of the test results to 2 to 3 weeks in most provinces and centers. But as you heard earlier, our physicians, you know, that wasn't good enough for them. They wanted them faster so that they could start making really good informed decision treatment options with their patients. So we ramped up at Save Your Skin our education and awareness efforts and held several physician and patient roundtables to really get a pulse on what was happening to see how we could try to get those test results down within the 7 days. What we heard and still are hearing from patients is that not all patients either know about companion diagnostic testing or have received it. Those that received it either didn't know what the testing was for and or were not told about the results. Although it's free of cost, patients incur out-of-cost expenses to travel to the testing centers, and treatment for many patients was delayed because the test results were not received by the oncologist, which caused high levels of anxiety while waiting for their test results and also really delayed their treatment. Just recently, Save Your Skin has sort of started working in the ocular melanoma field. And it's really been tough for us. It's a very rare cancer. Genomic testing, which really enables accurate assessment of metastatic risk, which is prognostic testing, is available, but the out-of-pocket costs are huge. There are 2 testing companies, one in the US, and the cost for that test is $2,800 US. and there's one in Canada, and the cost is $1,000. The only province right now that's getting that test covered is in Alberta. So we are now doing the Dr. Marcus Butler, Kathy Dog and Pony show, following the same plan as we did in the melanoma space. We have created Ocumel Canada and a Canadian multidisciplinary physician task force. We are doing education and awareness symposiums and webinars across the country. As been said a million times, not just by the docs, but us patients, we as patients know the importance of these timely test results. When diagnosed with cancer, time is not of an essence for us. So we need to get to quick, equal, timely access to our treatment as quickly as we can.
Thank you, Kathy. Filomena, following along that, as a longtime patient supporter and advocate, what have you experienced as some of the greatest challenges to getting these treatments and what to patients, and how can we overcome them?
Thanks very much, Louise. So thank you to the organizing committee for having invited me to participate today. I'm so grateful. This is such a timely invitation because precision medicine is an important topic to us all. We feel very, very strongly and passionately about it. So back in June of this year, we at CRAN hosted a 2-day biomarkers conference across multiple tumor types, which brought together multiple stakeholders to try to stimulate a discussion on timely access to biomarker testing results and try to address cancer care inequities in Canada. In particular, for the purposes of this discussion, we hosted a patient group roundtable on day 1 at the conference, which included the heads of 9 patient advocacy groups to try to capture barriers, challenges to biomarker testing and timely reporting of testing results, which they identified from their respective cancer patients. They did an awesome job of identifying those challenges situated at the intersection of patients and the healthcare system. Kathy Barnard was actually there, and she did a fantastic job alongside the others. 11 different barriers or challenges were identified by the patient advocacy heads, but the top 3 that came out repeatedly were 1, a lack of timely access to testing and reporting of the results to help inform those really important treatment decisions. 2, a lack of patient education and awareness of biomarker testing, due in part, yes, to a failure by clinicians to discuss the importance of biomarker testing with their patients, not because they didn't want to, but because they may not necessarily have had that time or a difficulty in understanding the subject matter and a slew of other reasons. And 3, the inter and intra-provincial disparities with respect to biomarker testing access, funding, and the silos that exist within institutions and between provinces. The implications that result from these identified challenges are that delaying biomarker testing or delays in biomarker testing results can absolutely impact the prescribing of precision medicines. And they certainly can impact patient outcomes. By way of example, allow me to share a patient case whose journey highlights this point really, really well and was actually featured at our biomarkers conference. A 38-year-old male was diagnosed with metastatic rectal cancer back in December of 2022. With his rectal tumor in place and metastatic disease identified in both of his lungs, he was deemed inoperable and was recommended for drug therapy to help manage his disease. So 1 month later, in January of 2023, his medical oncologist started him on chemo doublet FOLFOX therapy and ordered biomarker testing to further inform the patient's treatment protocol. Now, seeing that the patient had a left-sided primary tumor, they wanted to determine the patient's tumor's biomarker status, which included RAS status, to see if a particular precision medicine, an anti-EGFR therapy, should be included in his treatment plan in combination with chemo doublet. 2 months later, in March, the medical oncologist was notified that the tumor sample was not sufficient enough for testing, so another sample was immediately sent along. 1 month later, in April, the patient's wife followed up because she had yet to receive any results. And a second sample was then sent along for testing. In early May, she then followed up again because she had yet to receive any results. And then finally, by the end of May, the results were sent along, and they were advised that there was indeed a RAS mutation, which meant that the patient did not qualify for an anti-EGFR therapy. So the patient was started on bevacizumab therapy in combination with the chemo that the patient had been receiving all along. It took 5.5 months to include a biologic therapy in the patient's treatment protocol. Today, the patient has responded really, really well to treatment after the inclusion of that biologic therapy, and is finally seeking a surgical consult for his lung mets. But the anxiety, the stress that the patients and the caregiver experienced while awaiting those biomarker testing results, that's unacceptable. We recognize that this case doesn't necessarily represent the norm in Canada, but it does speak to the delays in biomarker testing results that are certainly taking place across the country. We hear repeatedly from patients that biomarker testing results are not being delivered by that first ever important patient oncologist consult to help inform treatment decisions. And the other issue that we focused on at the Biomarkers Conference was the value, the feasibility of expanded biomarker testing or comprehensive genomic profiling as potentially a future standard of care in Canada, which we all know seeks to test hundreds of genes for possible mutations through one assay. Our advanced cancer patients are exhausting standard of care therapies, and other patients are not responding very well to begin with, which begs the question, is a more intuitive approach to the management of their disease required right from the start? Treating their advanced cancer based on the anatomical origin of their tumor may actually be a less intuitive approach when compared to targeting the molecular mutations that actually drive the growth, the spread of their cancer. And so again, by way of example, allow me to provide a patient case. We have a 53-year-old female who's been battling stage 4 rectal cancer for 13 years. She was diagnosed with metastatic disease to her pelvic sidewall and gynae organs and underwent some extensive surgical resections, as well as exhausted all lines of drug therapies for her metastatic rectal cancer. And at this point, the patient's tumor marker, her CEA, was starting to climb and was at the highest it has ever been in her journey. And she was starting to experience some really significant and debilitating cancer-induced symptoms that were truly impacting her quality of life because her cancer was invading her sacral spine and crushing her nerve roots. She couldn't walk anymore. She accessed comprehensive genomic profiling, which revealed 7 mutations. And one of those mutations was an HRD mutation, homologous recombinant deficiency, which is often seen in prostate cancer patients, breast cancer patients, ovarian cancer patients, and for whom a drug therapy known as a PARP inhibitor could be prescribed, olaparib. Olaparib is not indicated for the treatment of metastatic rectal cancer in the patient's province's formulary. So the patient was forced to pay for the olaparib herself and sourced the drug from either the US at $17,000 a bottle or Canada at $8,000 a bottle. And finally in Bangladesh at $500 a bottle, where she settled. She started the olaparib in combination with Avastin and chemo. And after 4 cycles, her tumor marker, the CEA, immediately plummeted from 15 to 5, and her symptoms immediately improved as well. This, my friends, is the power of precision medicine, which has the potential, the ability to prolong life and promote good quality of life, and just as importantly, bring value to the entire healthcare ecosystem. When patients do well by responding to therapy with an improved quality of life, there are fewer ER visits, hospital admissions, fewer treatment-induced toxicities, and treatment cessations. And this should ultimately be the goal for every advanced cancer patient in Canada. At CRAN, we say, the right therapy for the right patient at the right dose at the right time. Isn't that what it's all about? I hope, Louise, I've been helpful.
Oh, that's been very helpful. Thank you. And I have to say, I very much enjoyed the conference that you did put on a few months ago. It was very eye-opening for sure. So thank you for all the hard work that you did in putting that on. And now, Bob, we're going to turn to you. I know that you keep an eye on what's new and what's coming up in the future that we ought to be thinking about before it lands on our doorsteps. So perhaps you'd give us a little bit of vision about where we're headed in this area.
Sure. Thanks, Louise. So yeah, just for clarity, unlike Save Your Skin and CCRAN, CanCertainty is not directly serving patients, but instead representing patient groups on matters of health policy, specifically the kind of policy that affects patient access to cancer treatments. And this all started, I can't remember what year it was, but I know Deb Maskins in the chat might be able to remember what year it was, but it started with the issue around take-home cancer drugs. And we found out many years ago that even though the first, a new effective treatment for kidney cancer that got added to the provincial formularies in Canada was very exciting for kidney cancer patients, we very quickly found out that a certain cohort of patients, particularly those patients that were under the age of 65 and didn't have private insurance, had to encounter significant barriers to access, out-of-pocket costs, delays in access to treatment, et cetera. So we started working on that as Kidney Cancer Canada, but then we quickly realized that it's not going to be just us. It's going to be every other tumor site that's going to eventually be encountering this. So we built a coalition called CanCertainty around that issue. And since then, we've expanded it to basically deal with a lot more policy issues that affect, a treatment access. So, some of the other areas that we've been looking at, like, as you said, a little bit more further down the road, but some of them are right at our doorstep right now, is, for instance, the issue of time to patients, specifically matters concerning the delays at the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance and at the provincial implementation level that delay access to promising new treatments. So we've been working with decision makers and policy influencers to try to, to find ways to shorten those timelines. We've also did a bit of focus around how CADTH produces funding algorithms and how access to treatments can be impacted by that work. We've done a fair bit of work around the issues of national pharmacare. And, for instance, we've been advocating that with respect to cancer drugs, that national pharmacare should seek to bring access to cancer treatments up to one standard. For instance, we're suggesting that national pharmacare efforts should, as an early priority, focus on bringing Ontario and Atlantic Canada up to the standard of cancer access that exists in Western Canada. And so we're watching very closely. We understand this fall there's going to be federal legislation tabled, so we'll be watching for that and getting ready to respond to anything in that area that may have that may pose as problems to cancer treatment access. A lot of work that we've been doing recently is one that I think that's very much something that we have to be concerned about, is the issue of how surrogate endpoints are used in clinical trials. So, what do I mean by, surrogate endpoints? We have to remember that, overall survival is regarded as the gold standard or primary clinical endpoint. But its utility is constrained by several disadvantages, specifically the time-consuming nature of trials that use overall survival, which has led to a push to explore surrogate endpoints and their potential to serve as primary endpoints in lieu of overall survival. But what we have, we've done a bit of analysis, and we're looking down the future. There's hundreds of clinical trials that are coming down the pipeline right now that are using surrogate endpoints, sometimes at the exclusion of overall survival. And while many of these endpoints are accepted by regulators like Health Canada, we believe, or we're actually quite certain, that provincial payers and HTA agencies will likely experience significant challenges in adopting some of these new endpoints for the purposes of evaluation and funding recommendations. So we're starting to, work with some of the policymakers in Canada to try to get them to move more quickly in this area, to develop new methodologies to assess these surrogate endpoints, to better understand their value. But it's not just working with these policy influencers. We're also working with the patient community to prepare them for this oncoming storm. So that's kind of the nature of the policy work that we're doing right now. To sort of try to ensure that that health technology assessment and provincial reimbursement policies keep pace with the innovations that are existing right now in the health sciences world.
Thank you. So if people have questions for the panel, please use the chat. And while we're waiting for that, I'm going to ask each of you to, in one sentence, if you were sitting in front of a policymaker that you thought could influence the work that you're doing and that you'd like to see for patients, what would that sentence be? Kathy?
Well, we're always talking about innovative medicines, and we're now seeing influxes of innovation in medicine. I'd like to see more innovation in how we get drugs through the process. I'd like us to use the word innovation in a bigger, broader sense. It's kind of sad to me, actually, to be on this panel when I'm thinking that in 2009, we were already having these discussions about, testing, and we needed them, in a quicker fashion. And it's now 2023, and we're still having those same discussions. So I'm really excited about, the CanCertainty and CONECTed and the collaborations between patient organizations, because I think we'll be better if we do this together. And I think we'll probably see better outcomes if we have this together. Bob, melanoma got our first targeted was a take home. And, we have and still have nothing but problems in Ontario for our patients, right? And that's been years. So, we're still seeing those same issues. So I can't stress enough how important I think it is for these collaborations. I really do. I think that's what might get us close to a finish line, if there is such a thing.
Filomena, what about you? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks very much, Louise. I hate when Kathy goes first because she has a tendency to rob my points. And so I typically try to list 3 in the event that someone robs 2 of my 3. So yes, collaboration is huge, which is precisely why we want to work collaboratively with as many patient advocacy groups as we possibly can. But to address your point, Louise, we're focusing heavily on trying to ensure that comprehensive genomic profiling becomes a standard of care for every de novo advanced cancer patient in Canada. So I would look at them and beg, plead, ask that comprehensive genomic, that every advanced cancer patient has their tumor profiled in the hopes that an alteration, a mutation is identified and potentially actionable for that patient in the hopes of improving patient outcomes. That's the hope.
So as the decision maker sitting across from you, I would ask, what's in it for me? Is it going to save money in the system?
Yes, I truly believe, much like my last points identified, I truly believed that when patients do better, healthcare resources are indeed saved at the end of the day. This might be an initial investment at the beginning, but at the end of the day, when patients do better, they are contributing productive members of society. Again, where treatment-induced toxicities are being spared, where hospital admissions are being reduced, where ER visits are being reduced. These are healthcare resources that we are indeed being spared, being reduced. This is what the healthcare value, the healthcare-based value equation is all about. And we're spending an awful lot of time on this. It's a win-win situation. It doesn't just promote value to the patient, it promotes value across the entire healthcare ecosystem. And so I think it's a valuable argument that can be made across the board.
Can I follow up for a second? For those who weren't on yesterday, I would really say go back and take a look at the recordings, because we had one of the physicians present yesterday and really talked about the dollar savings to the system if we were getting these tests done and in a timely fashion for all Canadians. So, I urge everybody, if you weren't able to attend yesterday, to take a look at the recordings when they go up.
Thanks, Kathy. Absolutely. And Bob, what would you say to the decision makers?
Well, just to reiterate, I think there's a couple tangible things we just heard. Developing strong economic evidence is critical. CanCertainty has invested significantly in developing budget impact analysis and things like that. And developing strong arguments, in support of reimbursement and investment. But I think in my experience, a lot of these things when you're sitting with with policymakers and influencers, it's often abstract or theoretical when you're talking to them, right? So I one thing I always like to ensure is that we actually have a real patient in the room at all times. So I want to stress that. I think it's absolutely critical to try to have meetings with influencers, with people that actually have real stories and real lived experience. I fortunately don't have those lived experiences. I'm relatively healthy, and so I recognize that I'm not as a powerful speaker when it comes to these things as a patient. But I also, when speaking to these people, I actually try to have them imagine themselves as a cancer patient. Like pick a cancer. And imagine yourself having a particular type of cancer and being told by your doctor that that there's actually a treatment that is available in Europe, perhaps, or in the US, but that it's not available in Canada. What do you think should be done about that? I mean, in consideration, of course, in the larger context of economic evidence and some of the value arguments that we're making. But I think often we have to try to drive our policymakers to be a little bit closer to understanding the actual experience of patients with cancer specifically. It's not unreasonable for them to expect that they'll eventually have cancer. I think the stats are now that 1 in 2 people are going to have cancer in their lifetime. So this should be very tangible for them. So my when I'm sitting with policymakers, I try to put them in that headspace.
Thank you. And you've all three talked about collaboration. And Kathy, you mentioned the doctor who really made a lot of the same points that we as patient groups make. So what do you think about, what are the collaborations that are really going to make a difference here, do you think? Do you want to speak to that, Kath?
Well, I think it's the continued discussion and education. In those early days, when the targeted drugs came into the melanoma space, we didn't only have to educate the physicians, and a lot of them, because it was new to them. We decided we were better. It was easier for us to educate patients because, patients are good at advocating for themselves when they've, been given a cancer diagnosis. We all know that. So to us, it's about, collaborating on, conferences like we did with Filomena, and issues. And I think we've done that very well with CONECTed, right? When any of us sees an issue coming up or within our own advocacy space, we know it's not only going to affect, I know it's not only going to affect melanoma patients down the road, it's going to affect breast cancer, colon cancer, kidney cancer patients. We know in Canada, when they make a decision, it generally transfers down to all of us in one way, shape, or form. So I think it's always being in connection with each other, so that if there is an issue within the colorectal space, Filomena can bring that to CONECTed or to Save Your Skin even, and then we discuss if that's an issue we're having with our patients. And again, that unified voice. Louise, you know better than anybody, in HIV, the success of HIV and getting treatments quickly to patients was the collaboration and that collective voice.
I agree. And just to say that our collaborations were not only between patient groups, but we had clinicians, we had researchers, we had industry. We really had a broad collaboration. And I confess that that's something I like to see for sure. And so hearing Dr. Kassam, as you mentioned yesterday, was certainly music to my ears for sure. Filomena, what about you?
So when we heard from our patient population that they were experiencing barriers and challenges to accessing biomarker testing, as well as the results, I thought to myself, this can't possibly be an anomaly to the colorectal cancer space. So it was intuitive to me to reach out to the other patient advocacy group heads, and lo and behold, they were experiencing precisely the same challenges and barriers. And so this is why it has become an absolute.
Oh, I think we've lost. Did we lose you, Filomena?
I think so.
Sorry. Oh, there you are.
Sorry about that. This is why it's become an absolutely imperative for CRAN to be working alongside the other patient advocacy groups, because they were all experiencing precisely the same challenges. Capturing those barriers, those challenges, those concerns, that was the first step. We've now produced a manuscript from that June conference that we will be sharing with the heads such as Kathy and the balance, that we intend to utilize as an advocacy tool. There's no point in hosting a conference if you don't intend to do something about the outcomes from that conference. So we will march forward. We will do something about ameliorating those captured concerns and barriers. And together, through one unified voice, a collective, strong voice, will do something about helping these various tumor type patient populations in Canada, because together we're stronger. Together we will have one heck of a voice helping our respective patient populations.
Bob, you spoke about CanCertainty and the amazing number of patient groups that have joined that effort. So that's certainly an example of important collaborations. What would you say about how to build collaborations well, and what kind of partnerships really work well?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, I mean, to capture a few of the earlier thoughts. I mean, some of the collaboration, the incentive of collaboration, of course, is driven by the logic and importance of speaking with one voice, because it has more impact. But there's also the necessity of understanding that a lot of patient groups just do not have the resources to effectively participate or develop their own advocacy, programs around certain issues, or even to properly understand these issues. So, one of the issues that one of the things I work on a lot personally with Deb is establishing the trust between other patient groups, so that they know that they can trust that the work that we're doing is appropriately modulated for all patient groups that participate. So, I mean, I think ensuring that that you are considering all the different patient groups that might be part of your coalition and some of their unique takes on things, right? Because we have every tumor type has got its own unique differences that separate them from us. There's blood cancers that have a very different set of issues than some of the solid tumor sites. So, I mean, establishing trust and really spending a lot of time listening and talking to these members to ensure that you're capturing their thoughts and needs, but also establishing that trust is really important in establishing those collaborations.
Thank you. Well, I'd really like to thank all three of you. I said at the outset when I introduced you that you really are profound patient leaders in our community, and I repeat that, and I hope that you will continue to be, because to Bob's point, patient groups can't always do it for themselves, but they certainly understand the issues, as Filomena has said, and as Kathy has said. They know what the problems are, and through collaborations, we can help their voice be heard in a collective way. But to your point, Bob, with a patient there who says, that's right, it's just this issue is just not about me. I'm an example of so many patients who really have the same kinds of problems. So that kind of across the board is really a very powerful way to deal with decision makers, I would say. So thank you three for giving us your time and your expertise, and we'll just have to keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So to wrap up our panel, I'm really honored to present Dr. Sandy Sehdev, medical oncologist at the Ottawa Hospital Cancer Center. He's going to give us a summary of some of the things that we've heard over the last 2 days that really struck him, struck a chord with him, and he's going to talk about access to these important medicines in the clinic where he works, and some thoughts about the road ahead for precision medicine in Canada and the challenges and opportunities that will get us there. So over to Dr. Sehdev.
All right, so thank you all for inviting me to give a wrap-up session today. My name is Dr. Sandy Sehdev. I'm a medical oncologist at the Ottawa Hospital Cancer Center. I've been involved in advocacy for new technology in cancers for many years. I actually started my science journey at the National Research Council in the 80s doing molecular genetics, and it's been very gratifying to see how far we've come. I've been asked to do maybe a challenging job of presenting a discussion about the road ahead from the clinician's perspective. You've been already entertained with fantastic presentations about what is precision medicine, how will it affect oncology in the future, and I hope to put this together today. As I'm giving this presentation, I will actually be in Madrid, Spain at the European Society of Medical Oncology meeting, where I probably already will have heard fantastic advances in this field, requiring us to constantly update ourselves. So just to take a step back before we look into the road for the future, where is the need in oncology? We've had a need for technology to better diagnose and treat cancers now going back, decades. We've come a long way. On this slide, you can see the importance of better microscopic techniques, better DNA studies that we're doing now, even things like CT scans and MRIs and PET scanners. Those technologies have over time, step by step, advanced the cause of cancer. Now the next big step will be molecular studies to better understand the nature of the cancers we're treating and the patients we're treating to really customize responses for them. Our past realities in Canada have been challenging. We've often been at the forefront of research, but sometimes at the last to the table in practice. We're recognized as having tremendous research staff and workforces. However, our history has been somewhat difficult in terms of lagging in implementation. I remember when CTs were new, MRIs were new, PETs, we often struggled and waited for many, many years before they came into our routine clinical practice. As you've heard, molecular testing and treatments are now a reality in routine practice for many cancers. Some are already publicly funded in the initial cancers where they were proven to have a role. But for new therapeutics in this area that have been related to molecular targets, our approvals tend to lag behind, and public access often takes about 2 years longer than it should. We're now the second slowest in the OECD. My colleague, Dr. Stewart, has well documented how many patients are actually dying waiting for access because of these procedural delays. So we can do better in the future to get these treatments to our patients. So who are we talking about here? You've already heard some patient stories about real-world responses to modern therapies based on precision oncology. We're seeing such stories every day in our clinics. These are not science fiction. They're occurring faster every year. I've just posted a few examples here. Mr. AY at the top left had a metastatic liposarcoma, the cancer that Rob Ford had years ago, had a very poor prognosis, and yet had a targeted therapy based upon precision testing and PDX models, and had a complete response lasting for 3 years. He was working and employing hundreds in his business. Mrs. SB at the top right is a patient of mine with metastatic breast cancer who was on third-line treatment, poor prognosis, and in the early days was found to have a PIK3CA mutation for which we have a targeted drug, and she's still doing very well. Ms. GL at the bottom left had metastatic melanoma. I recall how devastated she was when she had diffuse lung metastases. She had a complete response with immunotherapy before progressing with a very large tumor in her adrenal gland. We identified a BRAF mutation in her case, and she's had a complete response going on 4 years and still as busy with her job and parenting 2 children. So is this kind of technology ready yet for prime time for every disease? Well, not yet. But as you've seen so far, we're making rapid advances and we're getting there. And home runs are being seen. So what is it? Again, you've seen this discussed over the last 2 days. Precision medicine is an approach to allow selecting appropriate therapies for patients based upon molecular understandings of their disease. So you can see that if we can identify molecular markers of resistance or toxicity, we can perhaps avoid a certain therapy for patients. And if we have a positive biomarker suggesting a response and we have a drug for that, we can then yield much better results for our patients. What are we studying? Well, we now are beginning to better decipher the molecular hallmarks and drivers of cancer in the cancer cells, hereditary elements in the stroma around cancer that make it tick. And these technologies you've been hearing about are allowing us to better address these key activators that we can go after. Lung cancer perhaps is one of the best examples of how this has rocked our world in practice. Lung cancers, like non-small cell lung cancer, we now realize is really a basket of different diseases. Over a third have targetable mutations, and patients who have treatments based upon the targets are living much longer than we used to see just with standard chemotherapy alone. When I started practice, the standard of care used to be palliative care. There was no treatment offered for these patients, and look how far we've come. The problem is that many of these hallmark mutations or drivers are individually relatively infrequent. So lung cancer is a really good example of how many common cancers are now really becoming a basket of rare diseases in and of themselves. That requires, in the future, moving forward, application of rare disease frameworks to what used to be considered common cancers. Why this is important, again, when we see these home runs, this is a picture we've often seen before, not my patient, of a patient who had metastatic melanoma all through the skin, had a very good response to BRAF targeted therapy, but then a few months later, unfortunately, had a recurrence again. We're now beginning to decipher mechanisms of resistance and predictors of that recurrent disease or disease progression that may help us in the future. On the bottom right, you can see too how many more FDA drug approvals by year have been occurring as we better understand these precision markers and develop drugs to address them. So I'll spend a bit more time on this slide. This is about the when. When can we apply these kinds of technologies? So on the left, there's a column talking about screening or predisposition. Can we better identify patients with inherited hereditary mutations that may identify those at higher risk? we can target prevention or screening for those patients more appropriately. Also, will we be able to develop screening blood tests that will be able to pick up biomarkers of cancer in early stages before patients become sick? And that actually is quite a viable option that I think we're expecting to come to our clinics in the years ahead. There are commercial products being developed currently in the States that probably are not quite yet ready for prime time. And that will obviously change our world in terms of how we screen for common cancers. In the middle, it talks about diagnosis. How do we apply these technologies to diagnosis? If we have better molecular testing, we can better confirm the diagnosis, the subtype of, for example, lung cancer. What makes that patient's lung cancer tick? Is there a driver there? Some patients with cancers of unknown primary, these technologies will help us better identify what disease are we really dealing with. And also the measurement of minimal residual disease. Do we see evidence in blood of tiny amounts of residual cancer that can really help us diagnose which patients will be at higher risk of recurrence? That is already coming to our clinics now. As far as treatment, these technologies should help us better identify targeted therapies, immune therapies, more aggressive therapies, including CAR-T treatments that will be hopefully able to achieve the home runs we're seeing now in some individual cancers. We can better assess response of patients by molecular testing very early on before we see radiographic evidence, and also monitor for development of genetic mechanisms of resistance even before overt cancer progression occurs. And on the far right, surveillance, the picture on the bottom right is a time machine from H.G. Wells. But surveillance really is trying to predict the future. Can we obtain these blood biopsies or assays from blood of small amounts of cancer DNA that will help us to predict who's going to relapse and when? Again, these things are not science fiction. They're well on the road to development and implementation. When do we actually apply the data in our practice? Well, there's a complicated slide on or table on the right illustrating the suggested levels of evidence that we might use to decide when or how we apply data in practice. Clearly, level 1 evidence for precision oncology applications would be where there's an FDA-recognized biomarker predictive of response to an approved drug in that particular cancer. On the bottom, you see similar levels of evidence for predictors of resistance to therapy where we can exclude a patient from a treatment. That also will be very important. We don't want to waste money on very complex treatments with toxicities if we can better determine who they won't work in. The levels of evidence below level 1 from 2A to 4A basically in a stepwise fashion talk about situations where we have a biomarker. Maybe it's valid in that particular disease, but the treatment has not yet been validated or proven. Or as you go further down, where the biomarker has been shown to be associated with response in other cancers. In Ottawa, we like this definition resource of actionability and targetability called OncoKB, but I've listed a few on the left that can help us better tell when we're ready to apply these in practice. You've also seen before this presentation over the last couple of days discussions about the methodology. How do we actually do this? I just throw this up as a reminder because I'm talking about the road to the future here, how rapidly these technologies are changing. Again, what would have taken me a month to do in the 80s for very simple studies, now we can do in an hour with modern technology. And as these technologies move along and become more robust and more accurate, they also will become less expensive, allowing their broader application. We are at a time now where a large panel of genomic testing may actually cost less than a CT scan. And I remind people, for those that are younger, that a CT scan cost about 450 Canadian dollars in 1980s dollars. So the technology we have now, cost-wise, even though it's relatively expensive, it's actually much less expensive than standard technologies like CT and MRI used to be in their day when they were new. So the cost should not be prohibitive once we get these things into our hands. Also, how will we use them? Well, we're learning now that not only are cancers different, but as they progress, they change. In fact, each metastasis in a given patient, each site of metastasis may evolve its own genetic mutations, its own profile. How do we account for that heterogeneity when we're deciding treatments? Well, those liquid blood biopsies may help us with that. They may help us get samples of DNA from anywhere in the body to help predict, are we seeing mechanisms of resistance or changes in the biology live that will help us direct therapy. We also will need to look in the future at better ways to study these drugs. We've been looking at this for some time. Many of you are aware of these different types of trial designs, but because we're now dealing with cancers that used to be considered common, that are now being defined as a pie of multiple smaller niche subtypes, we have to start looking at these technologies and accepting them in terms of their utility for approval and funding without mandating those large level 1 evidence randomized control phase 3 trials that are not very possible when you're dealing with these rarer subtypes of cancer. So the basket trials in the middle, you can see when we're dealing with multiple cancer types or diseases where they have a shared single biomarker, you apply the drug for that biomarker and study how it works. That's one very important type of trial design. And in the umbrella trial, you have a single cancer type, for example, lung cancer, but you identify multiple different biomarkers or targets. And in each arm of the trial, you have a different drug against that, and you can better identify how to treat that disease type in general. Those studies are hard to do. They require collaboration, often international cooperation. They're multi-center studies. The numbers of patients enrolled may be smaller, but in order to get there, we'll have to be open to running these kinds of trials and also accepting them without the large phase 3 trials we used to see before with overall survival endpoints. What about next steps now moving forward? Well, we have these challenges: patient enrollment, the details around molecular profiling, how to identify what is clinically actionable, how do we view and understand the results that are on the printouts are so complex, and how do we find the right trials or the right drug for individual patients? We clearly need to have better access to NGS and molecular testing. We need more rapid algorithms to get those tests into practice. Right now, it varies quite a bit by institution in terms of what access they have. Do they have extra funds out of their own budgets to run these tests case by case? Is there a program? So it does tend to create a bit of a postal code lottery, even within one city, on how accessible the tests are. Patients cannot really often afford these tests out of their own pocket. We have amazing programs now, even though they're slow, to look at new drug funding, to identify, what criteria for efficacy and cost effectiveness to get drugs to us, but we don't really have that same level of rigor around rapid new testing and new test approval to get tests out there. What about the infrastructure for precision medicine? We often have large academic labs that can do this currently, but once they start rolling out into regular practice, do we have the staff? I understand they only train less than 20 molecular techs in the country every year. In Ottawa now, we're training our own in-house for over a year and a half. Do we have the funding? Sometimes there'll be funding allocated to hospitals for the reagents to do a test, but not the operator time, not the additional costs involved with actually doing them. And that can make it prohibitive or cost negative for a center to do these types of tests. What about access to targeted drugs? I mentioned that publicly funded access to drugs lags behind the evidence, often by over 1.5 years, and that will have to change. We will have to develop better models to more collaboratively and rapidly approve the evidence, like, for example, Project Orbis, looking at the regulatory end with Health Canada, and similarly, better models of collaboration internationally to let us actually approve them for regular practice and funding in Canada. The education link should not be forgotten. Moving forward, we're going to need Canadian guidelines, and we'll need a more broad access, even in community centers, to molecular tumor boards, where clinicians who are very busy in practice and may not have access to these types of technologies routinely can get expert advice on how to interpret the printouts from NGS testing and how to apply them in their practice, or where to find the trials to refer patients to. So these advances are moving along very quickly. There are more new drugs being developed than on this slide. This was from 2022 from Nature Medicine, just illustrating the spectrum of new therapies already coming out to us in clinic. And this is only destined to explode. So we need to, again, have these programs develop moving forward very quickly so we can get them to our patients who are in need. So what about the challenges? Well, I've hinted at a few of these. We currently in Canada have fragmented systems and various funding silos that unfortunately add a lot of complexity and time for our patients to access new therapies. Our drug pathways and our new drug funding programs are stepwise. They're often duplicative in terms of the expertise required, and they take a long time from the evidence of efficacy to access, again, over 1.5 years. We need to have programs for the pathologists and molecular pathologists to rapidly approve and have available new types of testing that they can actually apply in routine clinics or even at large community centers. I used to work as a general community oncologist in the GTA for many years. And after I left, come back home to Ottawa, Dr. Brandon Sheffield there at a large community center in William Moser Health System has developed a fantastic program, quite applicable even in the community setting. So we'll have to work on that and how to make that accessible. For drug access, these silos and overlapping processes are really problematic. We'll have to advocate moving forward for better coordination and faster timelines for these various bodies I've listed. We need to apply the rare disease frameworks for these individually uncommon subtypes of common cancers so we can examine the evidence appropriately. We right now have very many small niche groups of patients, and we'll need to accept surrogate endpoints, real-world evidence, and the novel trial designs that I mentioned, like basket and umbrella studies, in order to be able to use these advances more quickly. So right now, I feel very positive. You've heard all the optimism and hope for the future from discussions again in the last couple of days. However, there are still beginners. There are still those who are a bit negative and cautious in these technologies. These were some publications from The Lancet in July of this year and a magazine article in The Walrus from the Common Sense Oncology Group. They're based in Canada and they have American partners. And they basically are making valid points that currently the new drugs we're having are so expensive, they're not affordable. They talk about disparities in access internationally and how these costs and access problems are making it very difficult for many nations to be able to access and use new therapies that are coming out. And they also mention, of course, that a lot of funding and research into prevention and screening is getting sidelined by all this new tech and treatment. And I think we all share their perspective. However, we must not let that take away from our enthusiasm about the fantastic advances we're seeing in therapeutics. They will be expensive, they will be complicated, but they're making incredible changes for our patients. They're saving lives, extending lives, and we should be celebrating them, I think, and not being negative about their stepwise rate of advancement. Things take time. All the advancements are iterative, but we are certainly getting there. So in terms of my wrap up and just reflections, what else is there on the horizon? AI, artificial intelligence, I think will be tremendously important in this field. We should be able to better identify patients that may benefit. We'll have large databases from NGS testing, for example, and we can have AI scour those databases, even within centers, to identify patients for which a drug was developed, perhaps later, that was not known when they first had testing done, to allow us to recall those patients back. We also can use AI to identify pathways that are uniquely important within the crosstalk of the genetics of cancers that may benefit from further research. AI will also be able to better decode protein structures and design drugs. Many of you may have seen the 60 Minutes episode where they talked about AI being able to decode protein structures within hours that would have taken a scientist his whole PhD thesis to do in older years. So once we decode these structures, we can have AI even design drugs or putative drugs that might really be able to more rapidly help us in practice. These types of advances you've been hearing about will be coming into more routine clinical applications day by day and year by year. And I think the prices will certainly drop. So the prices for testing have already dropped tremendously. Many of you may remember how expensive the Human Genome Project was so many years ago. And now you look at the prices of a few $100s to get comprehensive NGS panels in Canada for our cancer patients. However, the prices will probably increasing for the drugs. This research is not cheap to do. The regulatory complexity around them is very expensive and contributing a lot to the prices of the drugs. So we'll have to have some framework again to really rapidly assess the drugs and their cost effectiveness to allow us to use them. These types of advances will probably further worsen disparities in care, because there will be those in Canada with private drug insurance versus those who don't, who will have more rapid access, and certainly there'll be nations in the world that just can't afford the technologies for testing and for treatment. I took part in a molecular tumor board at a meeting in Dubai back in October of 2022, and I was actually so impressed at how even doctors from Hong Kong, from Singapore, from the Emirates, from India were accessing PET scans, very appropriate use of NGS testing, without too much limitation. But I learned from those doctors afterwards, of course, it was from the wealthier patients or those with extra insurance. We'll see the applications of this technology to screening. My colleagues talk quite excitedly about this. Can we find traces of cancer, meaningful traces of, that are going to predict cancers that would cause health problems, not just noise? We should be able to hopefully identify those in the years ahead. And they will change the paradigms of how we treat cancers. For example, if we see evidence of minimal residual disease after neoadjuvant therapy, can we cut back on adjuvant therapy costs? Can we save money? Can we pick up minimal recurrent disease at earlier stages? Can we pick up disease evolution on treatment to help predict for resistance and allow us to change therapy before tumors actually get worse? Those things are already happening, and the data is coming in fast and furious. So I thank you for your attention. I hope you picked up on our enthusiasm over the last couple of days. The road ahead is a bright one. There certainly will be challenges and opportunities, but I think right now this is an exciting time to be involved in cancer research and cancer treatments. The transition of ideas to technology to treatments, that time is getting faster, and we're seeing these miracles in our clinic every day. So thank you again for your attention, and have a great day.
So thank you very much to Sandy Sehdev for that amazing wrap up. He unfortunately was not able to be here with us today in person. So if you have questions for him, please put them in the chat and we'll get them to him. The other thing that I took the opportunity to do after he presented was to ask him a few questions that I thought might be questions some of you would have. But as I say, if I don't pick them all up, please put them in the chat. Things that I found very interesting in your presentation was your reference to a lot of cancers now becoming rare diseases, rare cancers, even when they are within the same type of cancer. Could you talk a little bit more about that for us?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, what's defined as a rare disease, and I think the CORD leadership, the Canadian Organization of Rare Diseases, is all based on numbers. Relatively common cancers like myeloma are all considered rare because they're infrequent. But now we take this big pie of like lung cancer and colorectal cancer, and because we can identify these different markers within them, some of those subsets of those common cancers are individually rare. They meet the criteria numerically for the incidence per 100,000 Canadians. They meet that definition for a rare disease. So they require the same flexibility in terms of testing approval, drug approval that we allow for those rare diseases, where we cannot expect the big blockbuster, level 1 phase 3 trials, because they're not really practical. We'll always be the last to the table. And we currently are still often the last to the table in the Western world because we're not moving with the times. I think, as we're very rigorous in Canada, we're very good at applying our methodologies, but we're slow. And I think we have to realize that even though we defend our rigor and want to do everything perfectly, we have to also live within the reality of what's happening in the OECD, the Western world. We have to look at our peer countries as a safety check to make sure we're not just lagging behind and being too stubborn. But that application of that rare disease framework, the flexibility there, I think is very, very important.
Thank you. And you've referenced the fact that there are challenges that you have to getting the kind of testing that you need to deal with these mutations and to really be able to determine what treatment someone should have. What are those challenges?
Well, I mean, the commercial available tests like Foundation Medicine in the States can cost like $6,000 for a whole panel. So they're very expensive for patients. Very few will pay for that. We can get other Canadian assays for about $900, but even still, that's quite difficult to afford. And not every center has access to them on a research basis. So it is really a bit of a postal code lottery who gets to get these tests done to identify these rare drivers. The other challenge we have is once we have good evidence and even indeed guidelines suggesting that a marker should be done and should drive practice, the implementation or the actual rollout of that test in practice often lags a year or two. I remember when HER2 was new, in Canada for breast cancer, we fairly rapidly developed standardized, high quality, rigorous assays, and we have very good intralab consistency between testing. Similarly for BCR-ABL testing for CML, molecular testing, we had state-of-the-art, probably best in the world consistency and guidelines. But for EGFR mutation testing for lung cancer, which now is essential and now done routinely, that rollout, even access to the test in an easy way, took over 2 years. And it was really quite a mishmash of how we could get them. Private labs, going through patient support programs from companies. It was really a mess. You would not believe now how overwhelmed all the clinicians are in cancer, pharmacy nurses, doctors. Like no one has time also to do thousands of pages of paperwork to get, these types of tests for our patients. So we need to make sure that once the evidence is there, the rollout is actually effectively done and the access is seamless for our patients.
So when you say rollout, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I guess that where there's a lab, within the reach of the hospital where we can send our samples to and have the testing done. Initially, they might be done at large hubs in the community or academic centers, and over time, they might get rolled out to other facilities. But how that test is delivered, sent, paid for, how the results are sent back and interpreted, that package needs to be kind of done fairly quickly, especially when the evidence is already solid.
So the other thing that you mentioned was access to the treatments themselves. And if we're moving to sort of a rare disease framework, in essence, for many cancers, and assuming that you can finally, at some point, get the tests that you need to determine what would be the right treatment for this patient, what's the delay in getting the treatments to the patients?
We already have a substantial delay in getting regular treatments to our patients. There aren't that many regular treatments coming out these days. Most of them are driven by precision medicine. But the procedural silos and bureaucracy historically has been very challenging. But right now, we have to get this broader acceptance that we should be willing to accept these secondary endpoints. For example, disease-free survival, adjuvantly, progression-free survival, phase 2 data, basket umbrella studies. None of us want to waste money. We're all taxpayers. We know how expensive these can be. But currently, applying what we already have in our kitchen sink for drugs is already very expensive. We don't want to waste the money too on drugs that won't be effective. So I think we need that kind of systems approach to allow us to more rapidly approve drugs, to accept surrogate endpoints, to accept these novel trial designs, but with a very acceptable proviso that they should be critically appraised. They should go through the appropriate health technology assessments with a framework appropriate for these niche or rare diseases. shared risk models that are more common in Europe. So pharma has a risk as well. If they don't perform, they have a risk to pay on the other side. Managed access programs like they're doing now in England, Italy, Germany, France. They're looking at in Australia. Get the drugs to patients quickly. If they don't perform later, then you can take them away. But 85% of those drugs that get rapidly approved in England do pass the bar end of the day and stay in practice. So, clearly it can be done. Maybe we can just copy paste from other countries doing this effectively. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but we have to acknowledge there is a need to change how we do it now.
You know, Sandy, that one of the things we keep hearing from our governments is that if we allow treatments out early and then we follow them and they don't actually perform in the long term the way we hoped they would, that patients, they will never be able to take these drugs away from patients, that patients will, want to hold on to them no matter what. Do you think that that's really a realistic appraisal of the way patients would conduct themselves in other countries where this is a common practice?
I don't think so. I think, the American oncologists would kind of revolt. I mean, they want everyone to have everything. But I think in Canada, the patient groups would accept that, in my experience, because they know the trade-off would be there. They would have more rapid access to truly effective medicines, and most of them would not fail. By the time they get to that level, most often we're dealing with success stories, 85% perhaps. So I think they would. I convened a meeting in Toronto about 3 weeks ago now of about 20 clinicians, including leads nationally of oncology, pharmacy, nursing, and numerous medical oncologists, hematology oncologists, where we did a modified Delphi method to establish consensus on some of these challenges and controversies. And of all of us that we polled that day, I asked that question, would you be willing to accept the drug being taken away? 100% said yes.
And yes, and speaking as a patient, I certainly wouldn't want to stay on a drug that was toxic and ineffective. I would be wanting to move on to try to find something else that was really working for me. I think that's just logical.
Yeah, the stressful area gets into when sometimes you have minor response rates and you might see tumors shrink in 20%, but the final data doesn't show any meaningful long-term outcomes. And understandably, patients are frightened, they're desperate, they'll want to try based upon that response rate. But I think when you ask the leadership at patient groups, they understand that it really is not helping them. They would accept that.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for all that that you've helped us to understand. And really, also, it's wonderful to hear that we are at a time of real excitement in cancer research and testing and treatments. So I guess we'll just have to continue to urge our governments and those other stakeholders who are responsible to ensure access to all of those to do so quickly.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I'm so impressed with the work of your group. So thank you very much. And no, I agree completely. I think we still have to invest more in prevention, screening, smoking cessation. That's all very important. But these breakthroughs are truly exciting and will pave the way for the future.
So again, that was really a very profound presentation and wrap up, I guess, of what we've heard over the last 2 days. And so maybe we'll we're coming around in a sense to where we started, which was yesterday announcing again the launch of our business case on precision medicine, which we've called Getting Better Faster, the case for optimizing access to precision medicine in the wake of the revolution in cancer care. And over the last 2 days, we've definitely heard that we're in a fast-moving world of innovation in oncology, including personalized real world, personalized medicine, real world evidence, and amazing technology, with more on the way. And we've heard how important it is for our health policies and health delivery systems to keep pace with these developments. In our business case, we conclude with some recommendations. And these are by no means all of the recommendations, but I thought we could put up a few at least that we think would make a profound difference in getting access to precision medicines to patients. So certainly we need a restructuring of the present system from its current siloed system of health budgeting to a value-based healthcare system. And Dr. Kassam yesterday certainly agreed that we really need an entire reanalysis of the way we spend our healthcare budgets, and consider putting funding in different places than we're putting them now. We have to recognize the value of providing timely access to precision medicines and their respective companion diagnostics, informed through biomarker testing and reporting, and the growing need to adopt comprehensive genomic profiling as a standard of care by public plans. We need to remove any unnecessary red tape in clinical trial reviews. We need to recognize trial designs other than solely randomized controlled trials by health technology assessment review bodies. And Sandy just underscored that in his presentation. We need to accept phase 2 trial data where appropriate by health technology expert review committees, and we should accept relevant real-world evidence in order to fill in some of the gaps that we have in information as these exciting new innovations are rolled out. We need to develop pricing negotiations that are expedited. They're very slow now presently by the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. And we need to also, as Sandy just mentioned, develop innovative negotiation processes. We need to retain the savings from implementation of these recommendations in the health budget. And we always need to consider the social determinants of health in all our health policies and processes so that there really is equity of access for all people living in Canada. Nothing's more important than protecting the lives and health of people living in Canada, and tools are in our grasp, with more coming to do just that. Each of us has a different and important role in protecting the lives and health of people living in Canada. But we also have a common role and a common goal, which is to ensure that decision makers understand the necessity for provision of badly needed resources to support our research all along the research continuum, to support healthcare providers, allied health services, industries, including those in advanced technology. And last, but in my view, of course, not least, view patient groups that interface with patients every day who are terrified, unsure how to deal with the potentially devastating news that they've just received, and to provide badly needed direct service, support, and information. We must not let these patients and their loved ones down. We must continue not only to provide for their needs, but also to push the system to change with the times. The members of CONECTed that organized this series of webinars based on the business case that we've provided, and our collaborators and partners will continue to be forcing the system to recognize where we are today. And we trust that you also will continue to make your voices heard. Please read the business case that has been the foundation of these webinars, and you can scan the QR code on the screen and you'll find it there. Contact us if you have any questions at all about our presentation or our business case or our plans to move forward in the future. So on behalf of myself and my co-chair, Martine Elias, we want to thank all of you who made this event possible, including the CONECTed Steering Committee members, with special thanks to our newest member organization, CCRAN. Thank you to our speakers and to Kostas Trakis of Exactus Innovation, whose valued time he gave us yesterday to facilitate that first day session. Thank you to Katie Dennis, who worked very hard to keep all the logistics on track. And of course, a huge thanks to our funders, Pfizer, Roche, AstraZeneca, Bristol Myers Squibb Canada, Novartis, Janssen, Merck, Amgen, and GlaxoSmithKline, without whom none of this would have been possible. And most of all, thank you for attending. I trust that we'll be talking about this much more in the future, and that we will make progress in making precision medicine accessible to all who need it. So thank you again.